Settle in now. Let the pillow find its shape beneath you, and let the blanket draw itself a little closer, because tonight we are going somewhere very old together. Somewhere so old that the stars above it were the same stars, and yet the world beneath them was almost unimaginably different from the one you know. Tonight, and for many nights to come, if you choose to return, we are going to drift slowly into the ancient Mediterranean world, into the age of bronze and smoke and lamplight, into the long, slow centuries that shaped a king whose name has echoed down through more than 3,000 years of human memory. And if these stories are the kind that help you find sleep, the slow kind, the kind that carry you gently somewhere else and set you down softly in the dark, then there is a quiet community of people who find them here night after night, and you are welcome to become one of them by subscribing, so that these stories are always there when the night comes and rest feels far away. And before we begin, if you feel moved to leave a small word in the comments saying where in the world you are listening from tonight, know that there are people on every continent, in cities and in small towns, and in places very far from any other light, who are doing exactly the same thing at exactly this moment, resting, listening, letting the ancient world carry them slowly towards sleep. You are not alone in the dark tonight. Now, let us begin at the beginning, which is not the beginning of a single man, but the beginning of a world. Imagine, if you can, the Mediterranean Sea as it was 3,000 or more years ago, somewhere in the long, warm centuries before the birth of what we now call classical Greece, in that deep and hazy era that scholars name the Bronze Age. The sea itself was the same, that particular shade of blue that is almost violet in the late afternoon, that shade that seems to hold light inside it rather than simply reflect it from the surface. The wind came off it carrying salt, always salt, the way it still does today if you stand at the right shore at the right hour. And along the edges of that ancient sea, on its islands and its peninsulas, in its river valleys, and on its rocky headlands, people have been building, trading, sailing, and dreaming for a very long time indeed. This was a world that moved at the pace of oar and wind. Ships, wooden, low-bellied, painted with eyes at the prow, so that they could find their way across the water, moved between ports carrying oil and wine and wool and bronze, that alloy of copper and tin that gave the whole era its name, that reddish gold metal that was sharper than stone and harder than copper alone, and that seemed to the people who made it and shaped it into swords and cups and great tripod cauldrons, almost miraculous. Bronze was the material from which kings made themselves visible, and it caught the light of the fire in a way that made a throne room seem like a place touched by something beyond the ordinary world. The palaces of this age, and there were palaces, grand and complex and full of scribes and storerooms and vast quantities of carefully counted goods, were built of stone and timber and plaster, painted in colors that seem almost startling when archaeologists describe them, deep red and a particular warm yellow, and a blue derived from ground lapis, or from some ancient understanding of mineral chemistry that we can still only partially reconstruct. The walls were thick because thickness meant safety, and the floors were hard and cool underfoot in summer and dark and close in winter, when the fire at the center of the great hall, the hearth that was also the heart of the palace, the hearth around which every important thing happened, burned through the night and filled the upper air with a slow, fragrant drift of wood smoke. That smoke is worth pausing on for a moment. It would have been everywhere in a Bronze Age palace, not unpleasantly, not in the choking way of a poorly built fire in a sealed room, but in the way of a fire that is well tended and properly vented, rising through the opening in the roof, and taking with it the warmth and smell of whatever wood was burning. Cypress, perhaps, or olive, which burns slowly and hot, and gives off a smell that is slightly sweet and slightly bitter all at once. The smoke would have settled into the wool of clothing, into the hair, into the hangings on the walls, so that the very fabric of palace life carried that scent with it, that trace of fire and wood, and the slow, warm evidence of a household that was fed and lit and kept alive by constant, careful attention. And the lamps of this world were small things, shallow dishes of clay or bronze, filled with olive oil, with a wick of twisted fiber resting at the lip. They gave not the bright, steady light of something electric, or even of a proper candle, but a soft, swimming, slightly unsteady glow that made the darkness around it feel present and alive, that made faces look warmer and shadows look deeper, that made any room lit only by lamplight feel intimate and a little dreamlike. Dozens of these lamps together could light a feast hall well enough to see by, but never without the sense that the darkness was there just beyond the reach of the flame, patient and waiting. This is the world into which everything we are going to discuss together was born. A world of islands and narrow seas, of cities that were really more like fortified palace complexes, ruling over the farmland around them, of kings who were also the chief priests and the chief administrators and the chief military commanders of their territories all at once, men who wore their authority in the weight of gold at their throats and wrists, in the specific patterns of their woven robes, in the way other men stood or sat or lowered their eyes in their presence. The linear B tablets, those small clay records baked accidentally hard by the fires that destroyed the palaces they were kept in, tell us that these kingdoms were extraordinarily organized, tracking quantities of wool and numbers of sheep, and allocations of bronze for weapons, with a precision that speaks to a world very far from the romantic simplicity that later ages sometimes imagined when they thought of ancient heroes. These were not simple men in a simple world. They were men of considerable administrative complexity, living in a society that had its own formalities and its own hierarchies and its own carefully maintained rituals. And yet, and this is important and worth holding gently in your mind as we move through all the nights ahead, we also know that this world was fragile in ways that its inhabitants perhaps only dimly understood. The Bronze Age in the Mediterranean was a world of interconnection, of trade networks that stretched from Egypt to the edges of Europe, of diplomatic marriages and gift exchanges between kings who never met, of a system of mutual dependency that kept palace economies functioning. And sometime around 1200 years before the Common Era, perhaps a little before, perhaps a little after, the exact timing shifts depending on which scholar you consult and which site they have spent their life studying. This interconnected world began to come apart. The palaces burned, the linear B script disappeared, the trade routes went quiet. What caused the collapse is one of those great historical questions that scholars still debate with real passion, speaking of climate and drought and invasion and internal rebellion and the slow accumulation of pressures that no single cause quite accounts for. We will not solve that mystery tonight, but it is good to know that it is there, like a slow tide moving at the edge of everything we are going to talk about, that awareness that this glittering, smoke-scented, lamplight-warm world was also moving, always, toward its own ending. But that ending is far away yet. Tonight, in this first quiet chapter, we are only arriving, stepping carefully through the metaphorical gate, like a traveler who has come a very long way and is grateful simply to have reached the walls of the city and to know that somewhere inside there is a fire burning and a place to rest. We are simply here, in this ancient world, letting its textures and smells and sounds settle around us, like a warm garment put on against the night air. The salt from the sea, the smoke from the hearth, the soft, uncertain gold of lamplight on a plastered wall, the sound of the sea at a little distance, not loud, not dramatic, just present the way it always is in a world where almost everything important moves by water. In the next chapter, we will begin to look at the specific ground from which our king grew, the particular family, the particular bloodline, with all the weight of its history and its ancient stories pressing down through the generations. But that is for another moment, a moment that will come when this one has settled fully into rest. For now, let the lamplight hold steady in your imagination, and let the smoke rise slowly toward the opening in the roof, and let the sea move quietly at the edge of the world, just as it did on every night of that ancient time, carrying its salt breath gently inland, over the walls, and into the warm, firelit dark. The lamps are still burning somewhere in the deep corridors of memory, and it is to those oldest, most distant flames that we must go tonight before we can truly understand the man who would one day stand before the walls of Troy. Every king is the sum of everyone who came before him. Every throne sits on a foundation of older thrones, older bones, older choices made in rooms that have long since crumbled into dust. And when we speak of Agamemnon, of his bearing, his certainty, the particular weight he carried across his shoulders like a man accustomed to bearing weight, we must begin not with the king himself, but with the blood that made him. We must begin as the old stories always begin, with a man named Pelops. The story goes that Pelops came from the east, from a kingdom called Lydia, a land of warm mountains and rivers said to carry fine gold dust in their currents, and he arrived on the shores of Greece, with ambition and beauty in equal measure, and with a darkness somewhere behind him that the old poets never quite let the world forget. The story of what happened before his arrival, the story of his father Tantalus, and the terrible feast that Tantalus prepared, is one of those ancient tales that exists at the very edge of myth, where gods and mortals still moved through the same rooms, where the consequences of human arrogance were immediate and divine and absolute. It is said that Tantalus, in his pride or in his madness, committed an act so unspeakable that the gods themselves recoiled, and that Pelops, the sun, was made to bear the shadow of that act, even as he sailed away from it, even as he tried to begin again on new shores. This is how the story goes. Whether it is precisely true in the way that stones and tablets are true, we cannot say, but it carries within it a feeling of accuracy, a sense of how hereditary darkness moves through generations, how a grandfather's sin can settle quietly into a grandson's bones without the grandson ever quite understanding why certain nights feel heavier than others. Pelops came to the Peloponnese, that broad hand of land reaching southward into the Mediterranean Sea, and it is said he won his kingdom and his wife through a chariot race of desperate ingenuity, and that the peninsula itself came to bear his name in time, as lands do when a man settles into them completely enough. Peloponnese, the island of Pelops. He built something lasting there, a dynasty with roots that ran down through the limestone and the old dark soil, and he fathered sons as kings must, and those sons were where the trouble deepened. Atreus and Thyestes, two brothers born of the same father, raised beneath the same roof with the same inheritance promised to both of them, and therefore truly promised to neither. There is something almost inevitable about the conflict between brothers who both believe themselves the rightful heir to something magnificent, something that cannot be shared or divided without ceasing to be itself. The story of Atreus and Thyestes is long and terrible and full of betrayal folded inside betrayal, offense answered with darker offense, so that by the time it was over, it was impossible to say with any certainty who had wronged whom first, only that both had wronged the other past the point of healing, and that the kingdom of Mycenae itself had been stained by what happened between them. Mycenae stood then, as it would stand for generations, at the head of the Argive plain, its great walls of fitted limestone rising against the sky, its palace hearths sending smoke upward into the mountain air. Imagine those walls at dusk, the last of the light catching the stone so that the whole citadel seems to glow faintly, seems to hold the warmth of the sun even after the sun has gone below the horizon. Imagine the smell of that place, olive oil burning in clay lamps, the clean mineral smell of worked stone, the deeper, older smell of the earth below the foundations, and underneath all of it, faint and pervasive, the smell of bronze, of weapons and vessels, and the 100 objects that made a Mycenaean palace function and gleam. This was the prize that Atreus and Thyestes both desired. This was the kingdom whose lamplight both brothers had watched and coveted and ultimately torn at, until the tearing itself became part of the kingdom's identity. Atreus eventually held the throne, but before he held it, and while he held it, and in the way he held it, there was enough suffering to last several lifetimes, and it did. It lasted, it persisted, it moved forward through the family like a slow river moving through stone, carving the same channel deeper with every generation. The ancients had a word for this, for the curse that moves through a bloodline, the inherited sin that requires generation after generation of suffering before it is finally exhausted. They called it the miasma, the pollution, and they understood it not as something supernatural and external, but as something that lives in the choices a family makes, the patterns a family repeats, the way that children learn from their parents how to love and how to betray, and how to want what they cannot rightly have. It was into this bloodline that Agamemnon was born, son of Atreus, heir to Mycenae, grandson in the long unbroken chain of Pelops, who had arrived from the golden rivered east carrying his father's shadow. From the moment of his birth, Agamemnon carried something that most children do not carry, not just a name, not just a kingdom to inherit, but a story already in progress, a drama already several acts deep, in which he had been assigned a role before he was old enough to understand what roles were. The weight of the house of Atreus was not a metaphor. It was something almost physical, something that would have shaped the way he stood, the way he moved through rooms, the particular seriousness that seems to attach itself to people who grow up understanding that history expects something from them. The stories that the Greeks told about this family are among the oldest and most persistent they had. Poets returned to them again and again across the centuries, finding in them something inexhaustible, some quality that resonated with the deepest experiences of human life, the way families wound around each other and wounded each other, the way love and ambition became indistinguishable, the way the past refused to stay in the past. Homer would one day sing of the consequences of these old roots. Aeschylus, centuries later, would build his greatest trilogy upon the same foundation. 3 plays like 3 great stones stacked one upon another, the whole structure leaning slightly under its own weight, and yet holding, as old stone does, simply because it has been there long enough. All of that was still to come, for now there was only the kingdom and the bloodline, and a boy who did not yet know what his name would mean to the world. What must it have been like to be a child in that palace, to hear the whispered stories, the half-told histories, the names that made the servants look away? Children absorb the atmosphere of the houses they grow in, take it in through their skin like warmth or cold, understand the emotional temperature of every room before they understand the words that explain it. Agamemnon would have grown up knowing, in the wordless way that children know things, that his house was marked, that the very walls around him held stories, that his father Atreus was a man of accomplished power and unexamined darkness, that the throne he was being prepared to inherit was also a thing that had been fought for in ways that left marks. And yet there is also something extraordinary in what endured through all of this. The dynasty survived, the kingdom persisted, the line of Pelops, battered and stained as it was, continued to produce men capable of standing before other kings and being recognized as leaders, as the sort of people whose authority others felt in their bodies before they consciously acknowledged it. Whatever the house of Atreus had done to itself across the generations, it had also forged something in its heirs, a bearing, a gravity, a sense of the enormous stakes that attach themselves to power and the choices power demands. Agamemnon would carry all of this. He would carry the weight of the bloodline and the grandeur of it simultaneously, as the greatest burdens usually come wrapped in the greatest gifts. The lamps in the old palace corridors seemed to burn a little lower now, their light still warm but quieter, settling toward rest. Let the image of those ancient walls stay with you gently, the stone that held so many stories, the air that smelled of olive oil and old ambition, and the clean, persistent smell of bronze. There is more to tell, and the next part of the story leads us away from the palace for a time, into the uncertain years when the walls of Mycenae belonged to someone else, and a boy had to learn what home means only once it is lost. The fire had burned low in the great hall at Mycenae, and then one day, quite suddenly, it was no longer their fire to tend. Imagine it as a slow unraveling, rather than a single catastrophic tearing, the way a piece of woven cloth begins to come apart not all at once, but thread by thread, each small loss almost unremarkable until you look down and find that something essential is gone. That is how the world of young Agamemnon shifted beneath him, quietly at first, then irrevocably, the warmth and certainty of palace life dissolving into something colder and more uncertain, the lamplight of home receding behind him like a shore seen from the water, growing smaller with every stroke of the oar until it vanishes entirely into the gray. He was very young when it happened. The story goes that his father Atreus had already been locked for years in a struggle with his brother Thyestes, that bitter and corrosive rivalry that had poisoned the house of Pelops from within, like salt water seeping into stone. The particular shape of that conflict we have already felt, settling around us. The betrayals of trust, the terrible acts and counteracts, the cycle of wounding that families sometimes fall into as though they cannot help themselves, as though the pattern were laid down long before any living person chose it. But what concerns us now, what we want to rest gently inside for a little while, is what came after, the years that followed when Thyestes, by one means or another, held the throne of Mycenae, and 2 boys, Agamemnon and his brother Menelaus, found themselves displaced from the only world they had known. It is said that the brothers were taken or went to the court of King Tyndareus of Sparta. Tyndareus was a powerful man in his own right, a king with strong walls and steady fires burning in his own hearths, a man whose name carried weight among the lords of the Peloponnese. Whether he took the boys in out of genuine warmth or political calculation, or some mixture of both in the way that most human kindnesses tend to be, we cannot say with any certainty. But the story that has come down to us suggests that they were received there, that they were housed and fed, and in the way of noble households, educated in the things that princes were expected to know, the management of horses, the reading of omens in the smoke of sacrifice, the courtesies due to guests, the grip of a spear, the particular weight of responsibility that comes with rank. Think of what that life must have felt like from the inside, to be a child carrying the memory of one palace while living inside another. Every fire that was lit in the Spartan hall was not quite the fire you remembered. Every column of smoke rising into the cool evening air carried the faint ghost of a smell you had known somewhere else. Children are resilient in ways that adults sometimes fail to appreciate, and young Agamemnon would have adapted, would have learned the rhythms of Tyndareus's court, would have found friends or rivals among the other young men there, would have eaten bread baked in a Spartan oven, and eventually stopped noticing that it was not the bread of Mycenae. And yet there is a particular kind of knowing that settles into a person when they are young and displaced, a quiet, unspoken understanding that where they are is not where they belong, that the place they came from has a prior claim on them, and that someday, if the world is willing, there is a return to be made. We do not have detailed records of those years in the way that a modern biography might give them to us. The ancient sources are more interested in beginnings and endings, in the mythic arc, in the shape of a life as it looks from a great distance. So we are left to imagine, which is not the worst thing, the slow accumulation of days that Agamemnon and Menelaus spent in Sparta. Seasons turning over each other with the patience that time always has. Summer heat giving way to the amber stillness of autumn, and then the cool gray of winter mornings when the fires in the hall were the brightest things in a world gone pale and quiet. It is worth pausing here to think about what exile does to a person, even a comfortable exile, even one that looks from the outside like mere relocation. There is something that gets forged in that condition, a kind of interior steadiness that people who have always been at home sometimes never develop. When the ground you stand on is not entirely yours, you learn to carry your sense of self somewhere deeper, somewhere less dependent on surroundings. You learn to observe the world around you with a particular attentiveness, because nothing can be taken for granted, because the rules of one household are not quite the rules of another, because belonging must be earned each day rather than assumed. These are not comfortable lessons, but they are endurable ones. And it is not impossible to imagine that the Agamemnon who would one day stand before 1,000 assembled ships and command them toward a distant shore was shaped in part by these early years of learning to hold himself steady in unfamiliar rooms. Tyndareus's court would have been full of life, full of the coming and going that characterizes powerful households in any era. Visiting nobles and their retinues, merchants bringing goods from distant places, the occasional stranger whose origins were unclear, and whose intentions had to be read carefully. There were daughters in the house, most famously Helen and Clytemnestra, though those relationships belong properly to later chapters, to the moments when the strands of different lives will begin to weave themselves together in ways that none of the people involved could quite have anticipated. For now it is enough to know that those names were present in the background of these years, that the girls and the boys grew up in proximity, learning the same household, breathing the same smoky air of the same fires, sharing without yet knowing it the early threads of a story that would take decades to fully unfold. The return, when it came as returns often do in these old stories, through action, through a reclaiming rather than a mere homecoming. It is said that Agamemnon and Menelaus, grown now into young men, did not simply walk back through the Lion Gate and take up residence as though nothing had happened. Thyestes had to be displaced in his turn, the throne recovered, the balance of things restored to what the brothers understood as its proper configuration. The assistance of Tyndareus is mentioned in some tellings, the weight of Spartan alliance lending muscle to what might otherwise have remained an aspiration. There are other names attached to this period as well, older lords and their loyalties, the complicated mathematics of power in a world where everything depended on who stood beside you when the moment came. But the emotional truth of it, the part that settles in the chest when you think about it quietly in the dark, is simpler than any political arrangement. Two boys who had been sent away came back as men. The citadel that had receded from them like a lamp seen across water grew large again as they approached it, its stone walls massive and enduring, its lion gate exactly where memory had placed it, the air around it carrying still that mixture of sea salt and olive smoke and the particular mineral smell of the great stones themselves, baked by decades of Mycenaean sun. There is something in the human heart that responds to that kind of return, even vicariously, even across the enormous distance of time and imagination, to come back to the place that made you, changed now, carrying everything that absence teaches, and to find it still standing, still itself, still holding within its walls the fire that in some sense never stopped being yours. Thyestes, in most tellings of the story, was dealt with, banished or otherwise removed, and the brothers took their inheritance. What exactly became of Thyestes in this telling or that one varies, and we need not trouble ourselves tonight with the harsher versions. What matters for our slow journey through this life is the image of arrival, of reclamation, of the moment when Agamemnon first stood again, inside the walls of Mycenae as their king, the long exile behind him, the fire of the hearth burning in the great hall, as fires in great halls have always burned, patient and steady and indifferent to human absence, ready to warm whatever hands come to it. The lamplight of the palace would have fallen the same way it always had, pooling golden on the painted plaster walls, casting long soft shadows across the threshold stones worn smooth by generations of feet. It was the same light he had left behind as a boy, and yet he was not the same person who had left. That is the quiet gift of exile and return, if there is a gift in it at all. You come back larger than you went away, and in those walls, in that golden and ancient light, the next chapter of his life was just beginning to take its shape. The city itself waiting now to be truly known, its stones and courtyards and storerooms and altars, ready to reveal themselves to a king who had learned at some cost what it meant to want them. The smoke rises first, always the smoke, curling upward from the hearth fires of the lower town before the sun has fully cleared the eastern ridge, drifting pale and slow against a sky that is still deciding whether it will be gold or gray this morning. You are standing at a distance, perhaps on the road that winds down through the valley, and the citadel of Mycenae rises before you the way a dream rises, not all at once, but gradually, each detail resolving out of the general mass of stone and hillside, until you realize you have been looking at it for some time without truly seeing it. The walls come first, those enormous, impossible walls, their stones so vast and fitted so carefully that later generations, centuries upon centuries removed from this morning and this smoke, would look upon them and say with quiet wonder that only giants could have moved such things, that only the one-eyed sons of heaven could have set stone upon stone to such a height. The Cyclopean walls they would be called, and the name has a kind of rightness to it, a mythic weight that the stones themselves seem to carry without effort. Come closer now, and let the road carry you up the long slope toward the lion gate. The lions are carved in relief above the threshold, two of them facing each other across a central column, their forepaws resting on the altar stone with an ease that speaks not of aggression, but of permanence. They have stood here for longer than anyone in this bronze-lit world can quite remember, and they will stand here long after everything else is changed. Their heads, it is said, were once fashioned from a different stone, perhaps fitted with eyes of glass or crystal that caught the light. Though those heads are gone now, and what remains is the clean triangular suggestion of power, of threshold, of the boundary between the ordinary world of dust and valleys and the interior world of the citadel. To pass beneath the lions is to be watched. Every arrival, every departure, every ambassador and trader and returning soldier has felt that gaze from above, has straightened slightly, has walked a little more carefully through the shadow of the gate. Pass through and let your eyes adjust. The ramp beyond the gate is paved with flat stones worn smooth by the feet of decades, and it curves gently upward toward the palace, which sits at the summit of the hill like the memory of something important. The stones of the ramp are not quite level. They tilt slightly, artfully, so that anyone approaching on horseback or in a chariot is slowed, is made to feel the incline, is reminded in a bodily way that they are ascending towards something. The air here inside the walls has a particular quality. It holds the warmth longer in the afternoons and releases it slowly into the evenings, so that the stones themselves breathe a kind of gentle heat long after the sun has moved away. In the mornings, before that warmth is built, the air smells of the night's cooling and of the dew that is settled on the limestone, and underneath that always the faint mineral sharpness of the stone itself, ancient and patient. Along the inner face of the walls, storerooms open in a series of small doorways, each one leading into cool dimness, where the palace's wealth sits quietly in great jars of fired clay. Oil mostly. Olive oil in quantities that are difficult to quite imagine. Hundreds of tall amphorae, standing in their rows like a sleeping congregation, their clay surfaces rough under the hand, and their contents invisible, but present in the way that a rich green, faintly grassy scent seeps out through the sealed lids and mingles with the stone-cool air of the storeroom. This is the smell of Mycenaean power made tangible. The ability to store, to accumulate, to feed, and to light, and to anoint, to have enough and then more than enough, and to know with the confidence of a full storeroom that tomorrow is already partially provided for. Bronze is here too, in the weapons rooms and the workshops that cluster near the lower terraces, and that smell is harder to describe but immediately recognizable once known. A dry, slightly sour metallic etch, as though the air itself has been lightly sharpened, mingling with the darker smell of the charcoal that feeds the smith's fires. The palace proper begins where the ramp opens into the first of a series of courtyards, and here the sense of deliberate ceremony becomes unmistakable. The architects of Mycenae understood something about the movement of people through space, understood that a great king is made partly by the approach, by the series of thresholds and openings that prepare a visitor to encounter power. Each courtyard is slightly more formal than the last, slightly more enclosed, the proportions shifting, so that by the time one arrives at the entrance to the Megaron, the great hall at the heart of the palace, the body has already been taught to feel that it is somewhere significant. The columns here are painted, their surfaces carrying bands of color that glow in lamplight with a warmth that seems to come from within the paint itself. Ochre and red and the deep blue that was so precious to make and so lavishly used here. A blue the color of the sea on a clear afternoon in midsummer. The Megaron is the heart of everything. It is a long, high-ceilinged room arranged around the great circular hearth at its center, and the hearth is never entirely cold. Even in the warmest months, something burns there, a low-maintained fire that is less about heat than about presence, about the continuity of the flame as a sign of the household's life and the king's authority. 4 great columns surround the hearth, supporting the ceiling and framing the hole above, through which the smoke rises and through which on clear days you can see a precise rectangle of sky that changes with the hours, growing pale with dawn and deepening through the day, and holding the first stars at nightfall. The floor around the hearth is painted in geometric patterns, their colors still bright close to the walls where feet rarely fall, worn to a familiar dimness in the paths between the hearth and the throne and the great doors. The throne itself sits against the right-hand wall as you enter, and it is neither enormous nor theatrical. It is simply present, simply there, with the authority of a thing that has always been in its place and fully intends to remain so. The lampstands that flank it carry their small clay lamps, each one a pool of olive oil light that moves gently when anyone passes, sending long, soft shadows across the painted floor and up the painted walls. From the roof of the palace, if one could stand there in the long hour before sunset, the view carries outward in all directions with a clarity that feels almost like a kind of permission. The valley below is a patchwork of cultivated terraces and olive groves, their silver-green leaves turning in whatever breeze comes up from the coast, each tree an old familiar presence that has been tended and harvested for generations, and will be tended and harvested for generations more. Beyond the valley, the mountains define the horizon, their upper slopes bare rock above the tree line, their lower slopes forested and dark. And somewhere, on the clearest days, between the mountains and the edge of vision, the faintest suggestion of the sea, a brightness that might be water or might be sky, a shimmer at the limit of the eye's reach. The palace stands at the center of all of this, not dominating it exactly, but presiding over it, the way a slow heartbeat presides over everything that depends upon it without announcing itself at every moment. By evening, the lamps are lit throughout the palace, small points of warm light multiplying in the rooms and corridors, their oil-fed flames steady in the interior air and bending gently near the doorways where the night breathes in. The sound of the citadel at this hour is the sound of wood settling and fire breathing, and somewhere the low, ordinary conversation of the people who live and work within these walls. Not the great and formal speech of ceremony, but the unremarkable human murmur of a household moving through its evening, the sounds of a place that is inhabited and known and worn gently smooth by the dailiness of living. The smoke of the hearth fires rises through the ceiling opening and joins the cool night air above the palace, spreading and thinning until it is nothing, until it is simply part of the sky. This is the city, then. This is the place into which Agamemnon was born, or would return to, or would leave from, and to which in the fullness of long years he would at last come home. The stones would carry the memory of his footsteps long after everything else had faded. But that return is still many chapters distant, and for now there is only the citadel in its lamplit evening quiet, the smell of olive oil and stone, and the last of the day's bronze smoke drifting gently upward toward the stars. In the next chapter, the question of who sits upon that throne will finally be answered, and the long work of claiming a kingdom will begin. For now, though, let the lamplight rest. There is a particular quality to the light at the end of a long journey. The way it falls differently on a familiar hillside than it did when you were a child looking back at it from a cart moving away into the dust. Agamemnon would have known that quality of light. He would have felt it on his face as he and his brother Menelaos moved back toward the Peloponnese, back toward the great plain of Argos and the golden citadel that rose above it, the place that had always been theirs by blood and by the weight of every generation that had come before. We left him last in the care of Aeneas, or perhaps Tyndareus, the story shifting gently depending on who is telling it and in what season of the evening. But however the exile shaped itself in the telling, what matters now is the returning, and the returning begins with a man, or rather two young men, who have lived long enough in displacement to understand what it means to stand outside the thing that is rightfully yours, and to feel the slow, patient accumulation of resolve that makes action possible at last. Thyestes had held the throne of Mycenae through those intervening years, and it is said that he ruled it with the comfortable assurance of a man who has come to believe that time itself has ratified his claim. Time can do that, of course. It is one of time's quieter cruelties, the way it begins to sand away the edges of wrongdoing until what was seized starts to resemble what was simply given. Thyestes would have walked the megaron of the palace, passed beneath the carved lion gate, breathed the same smoky air of olive oil lamps and hearth fire that Atreus had breathed, and perhaps he had begun to forget, or to convince himself that forgetting was a kind of wisdom. But there were others who had not forgotten. There is something remarkable about the way loyalty to a bloodline persists, the way it lives in the bodies of old retainers and in the careful whispers of those who remember how things were, and hold that memory like a coal inside a clay pot, small and orange and breathing, waiting for air. And when Agamemnon came, he would have found those coals still glowing. The ancient sources do not linger long on the practical mechanics of how the throne was reclaimed, and this is perhaps fitting for a sleep story, because the mechanics of power are rarely as interesting as the texture of the moment. What we do know, or what the tradition broadly agrees upon, is that Thyestes was removed and that Agamemnon became king of Mycenae, and that this transition was not a gentle one. There is a version of events, told by some sources with a kind of careful solemnity, in which Thyestes was killed, and a version in which he was driven into exile, the symmetry of the whole affair completing itself like a wave that rises and falls back into the sea from which it came. It is said that the oracle at Delphi had a role in this, as it so often did in the lives of those the gods were watching most closely, and that Aegisthus, the son of Thyestes, survived and moved into his own long shadow of waiting. But that shadow belongs to a later chapter, a later night, and we do not need to look at it now. What we can look at, and what is worth dwelling on in the slow way of this hour, is what it actually meant to be king of Mycenae. Because Mycenae was not simply another palace, another hilltop, another set of clay tablet records, and storerooms filled with olive oil and wool. Mycenae was, by the measure of this age, something very close to the center of the Greek world. The palace that Agamemnon came to rule sat upon a rocky outcrop in the northeastern Argolid, and from that height you could see on a clear day the glittering distance of the Saronic Gulf, the fields of the great plain below, the roads that connected the whole web of the Aegean world. To stand in the Megaron of Mycenae and look out was to understand, in your body rather than just your mind, why this place mattered. The scholars and archaeologists who have spent their careful lives among the ruins of that citadel tell us that at its height, the palace of Mycenae was a sophisticated and wealthy place, with frescoed walls showing processions and figures and the deep russet and blue of pigments that have survived 3,000 years, only to remind us of how much color there once was in a world we sometimes imagine as gray and dusty. The palace kept records in a script we call Linear B, the earliest known form of written Greek, and those records speak not of epic deeds, but of ordinary administration. So many wheels of wool, so many jars of oil, so many men assigned to the watch. This is the texture of actual kingship, the daily reality beneath the bronze and the legend. And it is somehow very soothing to know that the great King Agamemnon, once he had reclaimed his throne, would have spent a good deal of his time attending to exactly this kind of careful, unremarkable governance, because this is what power actually is, in the end, at least in the quiet spaces between the moments history chooses to remember. It is the maintenance of a system of obligations and relationships so complex that it requires constant, patient attention. Agamemnon was Wanax, the great king, a title that distinguished him not merely as a ruler of Mycenae, but as the paramount lord among the various kingdoms of the Peloponnese and beyond, the man to whom other kings owed a form of deference that was real, even if its precise nature is still debated among those who study such things. Below him in the palace hierarchy sat the Lawagetus, something like a military commander or a leader of the people, and below them the various officials, whose titles survive on the clay tablets like the faint impressions of a world almost entirely vanished. Together they formed a court, a bureaucracy, a living organism that breathed in the smoke of the great central hearth and exhaled the decisions that shaped the lives of everyone for miles in every direction. Menelaus, for his part, would go on to rule Sparta, or Lacedaemon as it was known, and this division of the brothers is one of the ways the story of the house of Atreus began to spread itself across the map of the Greek world like roots finding water. The two kingdoms were separate but connected, as brothers are, by something older and deeper than politics, and the alliance between them would come to matter enormously in the years ahead, when the world conspired to require them to act as one. But Agamemnon in these early years of kingship would have been occupied by the slow work of establishing himself, of proving that the throne he had reclaimed was held by something more than force, that it was held by competence and by the kind of steady authority that makes other kings willing to follow. And there is something in this, a particular human quality, the way a person who has spent years knowing what they were born to do, waiting in a quiet exile for the shape of their life to find them, sometimes steps into that life with a sureness that surprises even themselves. The boy who left Mycenae had learned patience. The man who returned had learned how to use it. The great lion gate would have stood above him each time he passed beneath it. Those two carved lionesses or lions facing each other across the pillar at the lintel. Their stone bodies worn now by the same time that wore everything, but still present, still watching, still speaking in the language of deep stone about the power of the bloodline that commissioned them. And in the evenings, the lamps would have been lit, one by one through the rooms and corridors of the palace, the oil burning with that warm, slightly bitter smell of pressed olives, the light pooling on painted walls and on the faces of the people gathered around the great central hearth of the Megaron, the fire throwing its slow orange warmth up toward the hole in the ceiling through which the smoke escaped into the open sky of Argos. This is where we leave Agamemnon tonight, settled at last into the life he had been shaped to inhabit, the palace becoming his in the way that places become ours only through daily living in them, through seasons and ceremonies and the gradual accumulation of ordinary days. He is king. The citadel is his. The lamplight is steady, and in the next night's wandering we will meet the person who shared that lamplight with him, who stood beside him at the great hearth and helped to make Mycenae what it was. Her name was Clytemnestra, and her story is inseparable from his own. The lamps in the great hall of Mycenae burned low and steady in the evenings, their small flames barely troubling the shadows that gathered in the high corners of the room. And it is in that kind of quiet, amber-lit hour that you might best imagine the life settling into shape around Agamemnon and the woman he had brought home to be his queen. Her name was Clytemnestra, and she came from Sparta, from the house of Tyndareus, from a bloodline that carried its own considerable weight. She was the daughter of a king, the sister of princes, and she arrived in Mycenae not as someone stepping into a life that had been prepared for her, but as someone fully formed, with her own intelligence, her own sense of how a household should run, her own understanding of what it meant to hold power and to use it wisely. The ancient sources speak of her in ways that vary enormously, depending on who is telling the story and from what angle. But beneath all the later drama, and the weight of what myth would eventually make of her, there is the quieter shape of a woman who governed a citadel for 10 years while her husband was away at war, and who governed it well. That part, at least, is something the old stories do not dispute. The marriage itself, the story goes, was not the first of its kind for either of them. There are accounts, uncertain and layered with time, suggesting that Clytemnestra had been married before, to a man named Tantalus, a figure whose story is dim and who does not survive in any clear form in the sources. What is clearer is that the union with Agamemnon was the one that defined her life and around which the great arc of her story would eventually turn, whether it began with tenderness or with the cold practicality of political alliance as most royal marriages of that world did, is something we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that by the time the palace life of Mycenae had settled into its rhythms, Clytemnestra was not merely a consort. She was the queen of the most powerful kingdom in Greece, and she conducted herself accordingly. They had children together, and this above almost anything else gives some texture to what their shared life must have felt like. There was Iphigenia, whose name means something like strength of the clan, and Electra, and Chrysothemis, and a son named Orestes, the one who would carry so much on his young shoulders in the generations to come. A household with 4 children, with the noise and movement and small dailiness that children bring, feels very different from the world of armies and treaties and proud kings that fills the larger shape of the Agamemnon story, and yet that household was real, or as real as these ancient stories allow anything to be, and for some years it was the center around which everything else orbited. In the years before the gathering of the fleet and the long departure, must have been a place of considerable activity. The citadel sat at the head of its fertile valley, with the authority of something that had been there long enough to feel inevitable, and within its lion gate and its great walls, life unfolded at every register simultaneously. There were the formal ceremonies of kingship, the receiving of ambassadors, the settling of disputes among subordinate lords, the careful management of the palace's enormous stores of grain and oil and bronze and cloth, all of which required constant attention and a mind capable of holding many things at once. Agamemnon was the king, and his presence and authority were the formal center of all this, but a palace of that size and complexity does not run on formal authority alone. It runs on the daily, patient, watchful labor of someone who understands its 1,000 small dependencies. And that someone, the evidence of the stories suggests, was Clytemnestra. She would have known every storeroom, or at least known the scribes and stewards who kept the records of what was in each one. She would have understood the cycles of the agricultural year and how they corresponded to the palace's obligations to its people and its gods. She would have overseen the women's work that was so central to Mycenaean palace economy, the weaving and the preparation of cloth, the making and storing of food, all the productive labor that the linear B tablets, those small clay records that have somehow survived into our world, show us was meticulously tracked and organized. In short, she was an administrator as much as a queen, and the picture that emerges, even through the distorting lens of later myth, is of someone who found meaning and perhaps genuine satisfaction in the complex work of running a great house. What the two of them were to each other in the private hours, in the moments between ceremony and obligation, is the kind of thing that history and myth together cannot quite reach. There would have been evenings when the lamps burned down to their last oil, and the children were sleeping somewhere in the deeper rooms of the palace, when the two of them sat with whatever version of ease was available to people carrying the weight of a dynasty. There would have been disagreements, certainly, because two strong and intelligent people in close quarters always disagree, and the later story makes very clear that something between them was capable of breaking entirely. But that breaking was still in the future, for now in the chapter of their lives that belongs to the years before Troy, there was the daily negotiation of shared power, shared responsibility, shared children, shared walls. It is worth resting a moment on those walls, on the physical reality of Mycenae as the container of this marriage. The palace sat at the summit of the citadel hill, and from its upper terraces you could see across the plain toward the mountains and toward the coast, and the wind came through in a particular way, carrying the smell of thyme and dry earth in the summer, and the sharper, damper smell of rain on stone in the winter. Clytemnestra would have known those winds intimately, the way anyone knows the particular weather of the place they have made their home. She had come from Sparta, from a different landscape entirely, and Mycenae would have become hers through the slow accumulation of seasons, through watching her children learn to walk in its courtyards, through burying the dead of the Callus in the shaft graves and beehive tombs that clustered around the citadel's lower reaches. A place becomes yours through what it holds of your life. And Mycenae held most of hers. The relationship between Agamemnon and Clytemnestra was, the ancient world clearly understood, one of the great pairings in the story of Greece. Not because it was harmonious, but because it was significant. Because both figures were large enough to make their story matter. And yet in this earlier chapter, before the terrible machinery of the Trojan War began to turn, the significance was of a quieter kind. It was the significance of a working partnership between two people, who between them held the most important kingdom in the Greek world, who had produced the heirs that would carry the bloodline forward, who managed their enormous household with whatever combination of skill and friction and occasional grace that real life always involves. There are scholars who suggest, gently, that the myths about Clytemnestra absorbed and reflected anxieties about female power that were very much present in the Greek world, that her later actions in the story say as much about what that world feared as about what any real woman might have done or felt. This is worth holding lightly in mind as a way of softening the edges of what myth eventually makes of her, of allowing the earlier Clytemnestra, the queen in her lamplit hall with her children and her storerooms and her clear, watching intelligence, to exist in her own right for a little while longer. For now, the citadel is quiet. The evening meal has been cleared away. The great hearth in the Megaron has settled from its afternoon fire into something slower and warmer, a steady breathing of red light against the painted walls. And somewhere in the private apartments of the palace, the sounds of the household are easing toward sleep. Agamemnon is still here, still present, the long years of war still somewhere in the future, and Clytemnestra moves through her home with the assurance of someone who knows every threshold by heart. The lamplight holds. The stone walls keep the night outside where it belongs. And tomorrow, if you find your way back to this quiet place, we will slow down even further and simply spend a day inside a Mycenaean palace, watching the light change from the first fires of morning to the long ease of an evening feast, just to feel what that world was made of from the inside. For now, let the lamps burn gently, and let the story rest. The smell of wood smoke comes first, always, before anything else, before the light has properly gathered itself above the eastern hills, before the birds have decided what kind of morning this will be. It seeps through the corridors of the palace in the earliest hour, rising from the great central hearth, where the night servants have been coaxing last evening's embers back into something purposeful, feeding them with split cedar and dry olive branches until the flames take hold again, and the ceiling of the Megaron begins to glow with that particular amber warmth that belongs only to this hour, this place, this world of stone and timber and painted plaster. The hearth at the center of a Mycenaean palace was not merely a practical thing. It was the soul of the building, round and raised slightly from the floor, ringed with painted decoration, spirals and chevrons and running waves rendered in ochre and white and deep terracotta, and it burned continuously, or as near to continuously as human attention could manage. To let it go fully cold would have been understood as something close to a failure of stewardship, a small catastrophe of the domestic and the sacred at once, for the hearth was both cooking fire and altar, both the source of warmth for sleeping bodies on winter nights, in a place where offerings of fat and grain were made to the gods who watched over households. When the cedar caught and the first true flames climbed upward through the smoke hole in the roof above, something in the palace itself seemed to wake. The servants moved through the half-dark corridors with the particular quiet competence of people who have done the same tasks so many times that the tasks have become a kind of meditation. Water was carried in tall painted jars from the cistern, which was fed by channels cut deep into the rock of the citadel, a feat of engineering that the people who built these places took evident pride in, though they would not have used that word for it. They would simply have called it necessary and proper and right. The water was set to warm near the fire. Oil lamps made of plain-fired clay were trimmed and filled and carried to the inner rooms where the household was still sleeping, set in shallow niches in the walls, so that anyone who woke before the full light came would not be left in total darkness. The smell of the burning oil, a thin and slightly sweet scent quite different from the wood smoke, drifted into the sleeping rooms and mingled there with the smell of the wool blankets and the dried herbs that were strewn sometimes among the bed linens to discourage insects and to keep the air from growing stale. It is thought from what the later texts and the evidence of the palaces themselves suggest, that a Mycenaean king would have begun his waking day with something very close to ceremony, even in the ordinary rhythms of peacetime. The body of the king was not simply his own body. It was in some sense that these people felt deeply, even if they would have had difficulty articulating it in the abstract terms we might reach for today, a public thing, a symbol of continuity and order. And so the washing of that body in the morning, the anointing with olive oil that was scented with coriander or iris, the dressing and the layered linen that the palace women had woven and folded and set out, all of this carried a weight beyond the merely personal. The king appeared, and the world of the palace organized itself around that appearance. The great hall of the palace, the Megaron, was the place where most of this public life unfolded. Imagine it now, in the middle of an ordinary morning, the hearth burning steadily at its center, the 4 great wooden columns that surrounded it rising toward the painted ceiling, the walls decorated in fresco, hunting scenes perhaps, or processions, or the bright geometric borders that framed everything in this visual world with an insistence on pattern and order. Light came in from the doorway and from the smoke hole above, falling in columns through the smoky air and touching the painted floor, which was divided into squares of different colors, red and black and cream, so that the whole space felt at once alive and carefully governed. Men would come to the king in the morning, the word that scholars use, drawing on the later linear B tablets that give us our closest glimpse into the administrative reality of these palaces, is something like overseer or collector, functionaries whose task it was to move through the surrounding territory and account for what was produced and what was owed and what was available to be redistributed. They brought their reports in the morning, and the king or his appointed officials received them, and the scribes, for there were scribes, young men trained in the difficult art of pressing signs into soft clay tablets that would then be dried and stored, recorded what had been said and decided. Grain and olive oil, and wool and bronze and honey and figs and livestock. The palace was at the center of a web of production and distribution that extended outward through the valleys and the hills for many miles in every direction, and the morning was the time when that web was tended. This was governance, and it was slow and intricate and unglamorous in the way that all real governance tends to be, regardless of how bronze the swords are or how golden the death masks. There was a rhythm to it, a steady accumulation of small decisions that together kept a complex world in motion. By the middle of the day, the pace shifted, softened. The cooking fires in the kitchen rooms, which were separate from the main hall, long, low rooms with clay hearths and the tools of serious food preparation, had been working since morning, and now the smells they produced began to claim the whole palace. Roasting meat, the particular sweetness of flatbread baking against a hot stone, the sharp brightness of herbs crushed and added to a pot of something slow simmering. Barley was a staple, prepared in various ways, sometimes as a thick porridge eaten with oil and salt, sometimes dried and ground and mixed with water and drunk as a kind of nourishing liquid that could sustain a person through a long afternoon of work. But in a royal household there was also meat, sheep and goat most commonly, cattle on occasions that warranted the expense, and fish from the coast when trade and weather permitted, and the small, purple olives that grew on the terraced hillsides, and whose oil flavored almost everything. The women of the palace, including the queen and the women of her household, lived and worked in ways that the archaeology suggests were both protected and productive. The weaving rooms were among the most economically significant spaces in the entire complex. Here, at large looms weighted with fired clay loom weights that survive in the ground by the dozens and hundreds, women produced the textiles that were both used within the palace and sent outward as objects of trade and tribute. The work was skilled and slow and required a precise memory of pattern, for the fabrics that came off these looms were not plain things, but decorated with careful geometric designs, worked in colored wool, and it was, in every sense that we can recover, real labor. The sound of the loom, the rhythmic clack and thud of the beam, would have been as constant in certain rooms as the crackling of the hearth fire was in the great hall, a background note in the day's long, quiet music. Evening came gradually to the citadel, the light changing from the flat brilliance of midday to something warmer and more amber, the shadows lengthening from the lion gate and the great walls and the storerooms that lined the inner courts. The hearth fire, tended all day, was built up again toward the evening meal, which was the main meal, the ceremonial one, the moment when the household gathered and the day was, in some sense, completed. The king would have presided, reclining on a carved wooden chair or bench, and around him the members of his household and perhaps guests, traveling dignitaries or local lords, come to pay respects, or present a case, or simply to sit in the warmth of a great king's fire for an evening and remember it afterward as one of the good things. Wine came at evening, mixed with water in the Mycenaean fashion, and poured into wide, shallow cups that were passed or placed before each person at the feast. The fire sent its light across the painted walls and the faces of the people gathered there, and someone perhaps played a lyre, the instrument that these cultures loved deeply and associated with everything they considered civilized and ordered about the world. And the smoke curled upward through the darkness toward the stars. And so the day of a Mycenaean palace settled toward its end, as all days must, the embers banking themselves slowly, the lamps dimming in the rooms where people were already sleeping, the great hearth holding its warmth a little longer in the cooling stone. Tomorrow the fires would be rekindled, and the water carried and the accounts received again, and the life of the citadel would turn forward into another day and another season, and the vast unfolding story of a world at the edge of its most consequential moment, the moment when a distant betrayal would call all of this domesticity to arms, when the palace would empty itself outward toward the sea. But that belongs to the morning. For now let the fire breathe quietly in its ring of painted spirals, and let the smoke rise, and let the night hold everything gently in its dark and undisturbed hands. The season was turning toward autumn when the trouble began, and in Sparta the olive trees had gone silver in the late afternoon light, their leaves trembling in a wind that came off the hills, smelling of thyme and dried earth and the faintest trace of the distant sea. It is the kind of afternoon that seems made for stillness, for sitting in a courtyard with a cup of wine and listening to nothing in particular. And yet it was precisely on such an afternoon, or so the story goes, that the world the Bronze Age kings had built began, very slowly and very quietly, to come apart as it seems. You will remember, if you have been resting with us through these nights, the texture of that world, the weight of its walls, the smell of its oil lamps guttering in palace corridors, the way lamplight moved across the polished floors of great houses, and through long shadows that seemed to breathe. That lamplight had illuminated feasts and councils and marriages and oaths, and among the oaths that lamplight had witnessed, there was one that mattered above nearly all the others. It had been sworn years before the trouble came, by a gathering of men who were young then and full of their own importance, and it concerned a woman named Helen. Helen was the daughter of Tyndareus, king of Sparta, though the story goes, as you may have heard whispered across many centuries of telling, that her true father was Zeus himself, and that she had come into the world in a way that was unlike the coming of ordinary children. Whether that is so or not, what is certain, or as certain as anything from so deep in time can be, is that she was considered the most beautiful woman in the Greek world, and that this beauty made her simultaneously the most desirable prize a man could imagine, and a source of considerable anxiety for everyone responsible for keeping the peace. When it came time for her to marry, Tyndareus found himself facing a problem that had no clean solution, because the men who came to seek her hand were themselves kings and heroes and men of violent pride, and whichever one was chosen, the others might become enemies. It was Odysseus of Ithaca, already clever in those days, already accustomed to finding the angle that others had missed, who suggested the solution. Let every man who wished to compete for Helen first swear a sacred oath, he said, an oath of hospitality and mutual protection, binding every lord to defend the marriage, whoever was chosen, should anyone attempt to dishonor it by force. In exchange for this service, Odysseus asked for help in his own suit for the hand of Penelope, and Tyndareus agreed. And so the oath was sworn, by a great number of men, in the lamplight of the Spartan palace, on terms that seemed reasonable at the time, and that no one, in that particular moment, imagined would ever need to be called upon. Menelaus was chosen, and Helen became the queen of Sparta, and for a time the whole affair settled quietly into the past, like a stone sinking through still water. The Trojan prince arrived in Sparta on a visit of diplomatic courtesy. His name was Alexandros, though he is more often remembered as Paris, and he was a younger son of Priam, king of Troy, that great and wealthy city on the Anatolian shore across the Aegean. Paris was young and easy in his beauty, and the story goes that he carried with him a kind of divine favor, a promise made to him by Aphrodite herself, who had told him, as a reward for a judgment he had rendered in a quarrel among the goddesses, that the most beautiful woman in the world would be his. That promise, made perhaps in a dream, or in some high and windswept place where gods and men still touched at the edges, came into the warm and lamplit rooms of the Spartan palace, like smoke drifting under a door. Menelaus received Paris as a guest, which was the only proper thing to do. The laws of hospitality, xenia as the Greeks understood it, were among the most sacred obligations a man could have. A guest who sat at your hearth, who ate your bread and drank your wine and slept under your roof, was under your protection, and you were under a kind of protection too. The protection of having behaved rightly, having honored the gods who watched over the thresholds of houses and the fires that burned inside them. Menelaus did everything correctly. He was, by the accounts that have come down to us, a decent man, perhaps not the most commanding of the Greek kings, but honorable in the ways that the age required. And then Menelaus had to sail to Crete, as it is said, to attend to some obligation there, and he left Paris and Sparta as his guest, expecting him to behave as a guest should. What happened next, whether it was seduction or abduction, or some complicated mixture of the two that the ancient world itself could not agree upon, is something the story has turned over for 3,000 years, without arriving at a single answer. What seems to have been understood, at the deepest level of how the Greeks told the tale, is that Paris took Helen and sailed east with her to Troy, and that he took also a considerable portion of the Spartan treasury, and that by doing so he shattered the sacred obligation of hospitality in a way that could not be overlooked or forgiven or quietly set aside. Menelaus came home to an empty house. The lamplight in the palace still burned, but the rooms were different, in the way that rooms are different when something essential has been removed from them. He went first to his brother. You have been resting with us long enough to know Agamemnon, to have felt something of the weight he carried, the weight of his bloodline, the weight of his city on its high rock, the weight of being the greatest king in a world full of proud men. When Menelaus brought his grief to Mycenae, Agamemnon received it not only as a brother receiving a brother's sorrow, but as a high king receiving an insult to the entire order of things that made the Greek world possible. If Paris could take a king's wife from beneath that king's own roof, if the sacred laws of the guest and the host could be broken so carelessly and so completely, then no oath meant anything and no threshold was safe. This was not, in the end, only about Helen. It was about whether the world still held together in the way that everyone had agreed it should. And so the wheels began to turn, slowly at first, and then with gathering momentum. And across the Greek world, from island kingdoms and coastal plains and river valleys and mountain strongholds, messengers began to travel. The oath was called in. Every man who had sworn to protect Helen's marriage was reminded of what he had promised, in the lamplight, in the hall of Tyndareus when they were young. The gathering took time. Nothing in the Bronze Age world moved quickly. Ships had to be fitted out and provisioned, men had to be mustered, Cattle had to be counted and distributed, armor had to be checked and oiled, and all the slow machinery of ancient logistics had to be set in motion. But the kings came. Some came eagerly, drawn by the promise of glory and Trojan wealth. Some came because they had sworn and could not honorably refuse. Some, it is said, came with reluctance, sensing perhaps in some quiet recess of their understanding that this venture would cost more than anyone was yet willing to calculate. Agamemnon organized it all because he was the king of Mycenae, and that was what being the king of Mycenae meant. He sent his own messengers, oversaw the assembling of ships, negotiated between proud men who each believed themselves the equal of everyone else in the room. It was the kind of labor that does not make for great stories, and yet without which no great story can begin. He was, in those weeks of preparation, entirely himself, commanding, tireless, convinced of the necessity of what he was doing, carrying the weight of it the way a stone wall carries the weight of the roof above it, without visible effort, and yet with every course of stone bearing down on every other. The fleet that gathered was immense. The story names 1,000 ships, and whether the number is exactly so, or whether it has grown in the telling across centuries of admiring repetition, what is certain is that it was the largest gathering of sea power the Greek world had yet assembled, and that it was meant to cross the Aegean and bring back what had been taken, and to make clear to anyone watching from a high wall on a foreign shore that certain laws could not be broken without consequence. They sailed to Aulis, the long harbor on the Boeotian coast, where the ships could gather and wait for the right moment to cross together. And there, in that sheltered place between the land and the open sea, the fleet came together like a great slow breath drawn in before speech, and the water around the ships would have shimmered in the lamplight of 1,000 deck fires on those late summer evenings, beautiful and restless and full of everything that had not yet happened. Let that image rest with you now, the fires on the water, the ships at anchor, the whole weight of the expedition balanced in a single, held moment of stillness. Tomorrow night we will linger there a little longer, in that harbor, in that stillness, before the wind has made up its mind about what to do next. The water was perfectly still, not calm in the way that water sometimes rests between breezes, settling into a kind of temporary peace before the next gust finds it, but still in a deeper, stranger way, still as something held in a great hand, as though the sea itself had paused mid-breath and forgotten to begin again. At Aulis, where the long arm of the Euboean Strait narrows and the land curves close on both sides like cupped palms, the air on that morning, and on the morning after, and on the many mornings that followed was heavy and unmoving, thick with salt and heat, and something else that was harder to name, something that sat just behind the senses and would not be looked at directly. And in that stillness there were ships, so many ships that a man standing on the ridge above the bay and looking down in the early light might have needed a long moment simply to understand what he was seeing. Not a fleet in the ordinary sense, not the kind of assembled force a king might gather for a season's raiding or a border dispute, but something the world had not quite seen before, a gathering so vast that the hulls seemed to cover the water from shore to shore, dark wooden shapes stretching into the morning haze, their prows pointing toward a horizon that offered them nothing, no wind, no movement, no invitation forward. It is said that there were more than 1,000 ships at Aulis, that the beaches were so thick with hauled keels and anchored vessels that there was scarcely room to walk between them, and that the sound of so many men, the murmur, the shifting weight, the low restless noise of an army with nowhere yet to go, rose up from the bay like a kind of weather of its own, warm and close and constant. Agamemnon would have known this sound intimately by now. He had listened to it through the thin walls of whatever shelter he kept there at the water's edge, had carried it with him as he walked between the campfires in the early hours when the other kings were still sleeping, and the only light was the orange glow of embers and the first pale suggestion of dawn beginning somewhere far out over the water. He had gathered these men and these ships through months of sending and receiving, through the calling in of oaths sworn years ago over the divided body of a horse in Sparta's courtyard, oaths that bound every lord who had once sought Helen's hand to come to the aid of whoever should win her, should that man ever need them. The oath had seemed at the time a formality, the kind of ceremonial binding that men perform and then set aside in the ongoing business of their ordinary lives. Now it had pulled them all here, to this narrow bay, to this strange, airless waiting. The kings were all present. You could walk through the camp and feel the different textures of their commands, the efficient, salt-worn practicality of Odysseus, who had come despite his reluctance, and who was already watching everything with those careful dark eyes. The bright, almost reckless energy of Achilles, who had brought the Myrmidons down from Phthia, and who seemed to treat the whole gathering as something that had been arranged principally for his benefit. Old Nestor, white-haired and measured, whose memory stretched back far enough that he could make almost any present difficulty seem familiar, manageable, part of a pattern he had witnessed before. And Menelaus, Agamemnon's brother, quieter now than he had been in the first days of his anger, carrying his wound in that particular inward way of men who have been personally deeply humiliated and do not know what to do with the feeling except press it down and hold it still. All of them eating through their provisions, watching their men grow restless, watching the water each morning for any sign of a changed wind, and finding none. The heat was its own presence. Aulis in summer is not a cruel place exactly, but the narrowness of the strait and the stillness of the air that had now settled over it conspired to make the days heavy and close, the kind of heat that settles into cloth and skin and does not lift even at night when the stars came out hard and clear over the motionless bay. The men swam when they could, or sat in whatever shade the ship's hulls offered in the afternoon, or occupied themselves with the small repetitive maintenance of equipment, oiling leather, sharpening bronze, repairing the endless small things that armies in any age must perpetually repair. They told stories, they diced, they argued over things that had nothing to do with Troy, and everything to do with the simple pressure of too many men in too small a space with nothing yet to do. Agamemnon walked among them and performed what a high king must perform: visible confidence, steady address, the body language of a man who knows something those around him do not quite know yet, who is waiting not because he is helpless, but because he is deliberate. It is not easy, this performance, under any circumstances. Under these circumstances, with the days accumulating into something that began to feel less like a delay and more like a prohibition, it required from him a kind of continuous interior effort that left no room for the ordinary movements of a tired mind toward rest. He slept poorly. The story goes that he was seen more than once, walking alone near the water in the deepest part of the night, standing at the very edge where the wavelets, if there had been wavelets, would have reached his sandals, looking out at nothing. The priests had been consulted. Calchas, the seer who had come with the fleet, and whose readings of signs and flights of birds the Greeks relied upon for guidance through what they could not otherwise understand, Calchas had been asked to look at the stillness and say what it meant, and the answer that came back through the formal language of prophecy was not comfortable. The goddess Artemis was said to be displeased. The specific nature of that displeasure, and what might resolve it, would become, in the days to follow, the darkest and most heavily weighted question of Agamemnon's life. But for now, in this chapter of the story, that weight was only just beginning to make itself known. It sat at the edge of his awareness, the way the stillness sat at the edge of the bay, present and total, and not yet fully reckoned with. What he held most clearly in his mind during these days, it seems, or what we might imagine him holding, if we try to stand for a moment inside the particular loneliness of supreme command, was the sheer factual weight of what had been assembled here under his authority. Every ship represented a community that had emptied itself of fighting men. Every lord in this camp had left behind him a palace, a household, a wife, children, the whole slow texture of a life, in order to come here on the strength of an oath and the momentum of Agamemnon's call. They were his. The responsibility of them was his. If the fleet rotted here in a windless bay, if the provisions ran out, if disease moved through the crowded camp, all of that would be laid at his feet, because he was the one who had sent the word. He was the one who had named himself the High King capable of leading this thing. The ships were here because of him. The stillness was here because of something else, something larger than any of them. And the gap between those two facts was where Agamemnon now lived, in the long, unmoving days at Aulis, waiting for the world to tell him what it wanted from him. The fires along the beach burned down to coals each night and were built back up at dawn, the smoke rising perfectly vertical in the still air, threading upward with nowhere to go, spreading into a low haze that hung above the camp and gave the mornings at Aulis a soft, gray, slightly dreamlike quality, as though the whole scene were something being remembered, rather than something happening. The water caught that haze and held it, mirroring the pale sky back at itself, undisturbed, waiting with a patience that had nothing human in it. Soon, though soon is perhaps not quite the right word for those heavy weeks, the question that Calchas had set before them would need an answer. And Agamemnon, the most powerful king in Greece, would have to find within himself whatever it was that a man finds when everything he has gathered and everything he is reaches its most terrible crossroads. But that is a weight we will carry gently together in the next quiet hour of this story, when you are ready to let it come to you slowly, as all difficult things are best received, slowly and in the soft company of almost sleep. For now, the fires hold their warmth along the shore, the smoke rises and spreads, the water rests, and so may you. The fires along the shore have burned low by now, most of them, and the camp at Aulis has settled into that particular silence that comes when a great number of men have given up waiting for something and simply fallen into the exhausted rhythm of days that do not change. The water in the straits is still. It has been still for so long that the men have stopped looking at it with hope, stopped reading the surface of it for any tremor of breath, any darkening that might mean the wind was stirring somewhere out beyond the headlands. The water simply lies there, flat and pale and patient, holding its reflection of a sky that offers nothing. Agamemnon has not slept well for many nights. It is said that the goddess Artemis had turned her face against the fleet. Though the reasons given in the old stories vary in their telling, as such reasons often do when the distance between an event and its telling has grown very wide. Some say he had killed a stag sacred to her, perhaps without knowing, perhaps in some moment of careless pride, a boast made to the empty air that the goddess had heard and remembered. Others say the offense was older than that, something inherited, something that ran in the blood of the house of Atreus, the way all things seem to run in that blood, accumulated and unresolved, waiting for a moment like this one to surface. Whatever the cause, the prophet Calchas had read the omens, had stood in the early morning light with the smell of smoke in his robes, and had spoken words that no one in the camp wished to hear. There was only one way to turn the goddess's gaze back toward the fleet. Only one offering she would accept. The name Iphigenia means, in some old tellings, something like the strength that is born some noble life, and she was Agamemnon's eldest daughter, a girl on the edge of becoming a young woman, raised in the great palace at Mycenae, where the lamplight played along the painted walls and the smell of olive oil and cedar wood drifted through the corridors. She had grown up in a world of ceremony and order, of feasts and seasons, and the careful rituals that marked one part of the year from another. She had known her father as kings' daughters know their fathers, at a certain formal distance, a man enormous in his public significance, occasionally present in warm and private moments, a figure of great authority who was also in quieter hours simply a man who had a particular way of sitting by the fire. The messenger was sent to Mycenae. The story goes, in the version most gently remembered, that the message carried a deception, that Iphigenia was told she was being called to Aulis to be married to Achilles himself, the greatest of the Greek warriors, a match that would have been spoken of with wonder throughout all of Greece. Whether Clytemnestra was given the same deception or discovered the truth before she arrived, the old accounts do not entirely agree, but she came to Aulis with her daughter, and what she found was not a wedding. What she found was a camp full of silent men and a husband who could not meet her eyes. It is very difficult, even across the immense distance of these millennia, even with the gentle mythic haze that the years have settled over everything, to sit comfortably with this part of the story. It asks something of us that the rest of the tale does not quite ask in the same way. The fall of cities, the pride of kings, the quarrels over treasure and honor, these belong to a world that feels, for all its strangeness, legible to us. But this particular weight, the weight of a father standing between his daughter and an obligation he has decided he cannot refuse, this feels very close and very human and very quietly terrible. The sources that survive are careful with it, and perhaps we should be too. What the ancient sources suggest, and the tragedians after them would explore in ways that are still arresting to read, is that Agamemnon did not make this decision easily, that there were days of refusal before there was acquiescence, that Menelaus, his brother, urged one course, and then when he saw what that course required, urged the other, that Agamemnon was caught in a place that had no floor, where every direction was a kind of falling. He was the high king. 1,000 ships, and all their men were waiting. He had called these kings and lords and warriors with promises he could not easily unmake. The fleet had purpose and momentum, and a great oath behind it, and all of that was gathered here at Aulis, like a river that has found its way to a single narrow passage through stone, and has no other way to go. He was also a father. It is said in some tellings that Iphigenia at some point came to a kind of acceptance, even a willing one, that she stepped into the role that myth had made for her, with something like grace, asking only that no one restrain her, that she be allowed to walk to the altar herself. There is a version of the story, the version that some found too consoling to believe, and others found necessary to hold on to, in which Artemis at the final moment accepted the sacrifice in a different form, placed a deer upon the altar in Iphigenia's place, and carried the girl herself away to a farther shore, to Taurus, where she would become a priestess in the goddess's own temple, alive, preserved, taken into the care of the divine in a way that replaced one life with another kind of life entirely. Whether you rest in that version tonight, or whether you hold the other one, the harder one, is perhaps a matter of what you need from the story. Both have been believed. Both have been told with tenderness by people who understood that some events in the human past resist the comfort of easy resolution. What seems to remain in the memory of the myth, regardless of which version is followed, what leaves its mark on everything that comes after in Agamemnon's story, is the simple fact of the altar at Aulis and what it cost. It stays in Clytemnestra's eyes when she watches her husband cross the threshold of their palace in Mycenae years later. It stays somewhere in Agamemnon himself, in that particular way that things we have permitted to happen, things we have allowed even when we might have refused, take up residence in the quiet hours and do not entirely leave. The wind, when it came from the north, just a breath, along the surface of the water, barely enough to stir the reflections, barely enough to notice, unless you had been watching the water for a very long time and had learned to read even the smallest change in it. But the men noticed. The men who had been sleeping and waking and sleeping again for weeks noticed immediately, because men who are waiting for something notice the first sign of it before they are even fully conscious of having seen it. The sails began to fill. There is something in that image that is both beautiful and very sad, as if the world simply continues its business regardless of what has been spent to purchase a favorable moment within it. The sea did not know what had happened on the shore. The wind came, because winds come, following their own enormous and indifferent patterns. And the fleet was ready, and the oarsmen took their places, and the great creak and groan of 1,000 ships stirring to life at once rose over the straits of Aulis like a sound that the whole Aegean might have heard. Agamemnon stood at the prow of his ship. It is easy to imagine, watching the coast of Greece fall slowly behind him, the shore growing pale and then gray, and then simply a line on the water, and then nothing at all. The sea opened ahead of the fleet in every direction, wide and silver dark and enormous, carrying on its surface the glittering path of a sun that was already beginning to lower toward the west. Somewhere out along that path, many days ahead, the walls of Troy waited, and with them whatever else was waiting, though no man sailing that morning could know exactly what shape that waiting would take. For now there was only the wind, and the water, and the slow receding of everything that had been left behind, and the sound of 1,000 ships moving together through the ancient Aegean, the waves folding against their hulls in a low, continuous murmur that was, for all its sadness, also strangely like the sound of something beginning. Rest now, and when we find our way back together, we will be out on the open water, watching the coast of Greece disappear, and Troy draw nearer with every long, salt-scented mile. The water moved again, after all those days of terrible stillness, after the flat bronze mirror that the sea at Aulis had become, after the smoke of the sacred fire had risen, and the winds had answered with that first tentative breath across the strait. The water moved again, and the ships of Greece began slowly, like a great creature waking from a long and heavy sleep to breathe. There is something almost impossible to hold in the mind. The sheer scale of what was assembled there, in the pale morning light, off the coast of Boeotia. The ancient poets counted nearly 1,200 ships, and even allowing for the ways that memory stretches and time enlarges, even granting that the numbers may have grown with the telling, the fleet that moved out from Aulis on that morning must have been something that no one who witnessed it ever fully found words for afterward. They would have tried, sitting by their own fires in their own old age, reaching for some comparison that could carry the weight of what their eyes had seen, and each time falling just a little short, the way one always falls short when trying to describe a thing that was simply too large for any single glance to contain. The sails came down from their storage, rough and heavy with the days of disuse, smelling of salt and linseed, and the particular dusty darkness of a ship's hold in still weather. Sailors who had spent those waiting days sharpening things that did not need sharpening, mending ropes that were not yet frayed, watching the trees along the shore for any movement that might signal a change. Those sailors now had work again, real work, the work that is almost indistinguishable from release. The oars moved first, because no sailor trusts a new wind until he has felt it for a while, until he has decided in that wordless way that experienced men decide such things, that the wind intends to keep its promise. And so the long oar blades dipped and rose, and the water came off them in thin silver sheets in the early light, and slowly, the harbor began to empty. Agamemnon's own ship would have led the way, or been among the first. This is how such things were arranged. This is what being the High King meant in the most visible and ceremonial sense, that you went first into the open water, that your prow cut the seal of the unknown before anyone else's. One imagines the carved figure at the bow, catching the light as the ship came around and pointed eastward, and the coastline of Aulis beginning very gradually to shrink behind them, becoming first a smear of dark trees and pale rock, then a shadow, then a memory, and the wind that had killed so much, that had cost so much to summon, that carried in its warmth the terrible price of Iphigenia's life, that wind pressed steadily and without apology against the sails, filling them round and smooth, driving the ships forward as though it felt nothing at all about any of it. Which perhaps is the hardest thing about wind. It does not remember what it has required of us. The Aegean in the months before autumn is a sea of a particular temperament, blue that shifts toward green near the shallows, green that shifts toward black in the deep channels between the islands, and everywhere the light catching the small waves, so that the surface seems to be covered in something beaten and bright, like the inside of a smithy when the bronze is new. The islands themselves appear and disappear as a fleet moves through them, rising from the horizon as gray and blue shapes, taking on the texture of cliff and pine and pale beach as you pass close, then falling away behind until they are once again gray shapes, then nothing. Sailing through the Aegean is sailing through a world that is always changing its mind about how much it will show you. The men aboard those ships were a whole world in miniature. There were kings and the sons of kings, men whose names would be remembered for 3,000 years, and beside them ordinary soldiers who left no names at all, who ate their salted fish and watched the islands pass, and thought about whatever it is that soldiers think about when the action has not yet begun and the destination is still abstract. There would have been the particular silence that settles over large groups of people when they are moving through something impressive and indifferent. The silence that is not quite awe, but is close to it. The silence of many people separately thinking that what they are part of is too large for speech. The ships themselves deserve a moment's attention, because they were not the grand vessels that later imagination sometimes gives them. They were long and narrow, built for speed and for being pulled up onto beaches, rather than for comfort over many days at sea. The wood was dark with pitch below the waterline, and pale above it, and the hulls were decorated according to each king's custom. Painted eyes at the prow, as was the Aegean habit, so that the ship might see where it was going, or bright bands of color along the railings. The smell of them was the smell of tar and salt, and the bodies of many men close together, and the sound was the constant complaint of wood under tension, the rigging singing its one low note, the water always speaking against the hull. They threaded through the islands of the northern Aegean, past Lemnos, it is said, where the fleet would pause and provision, where the story of Philoctetes and his terrible wound belongs, though that is a later sorrow, and tonight we need not linger there. Past the shapes of islands, whose names in those days may have been different from the names we give them now, islands that in the darkness of night would have been invisible except where their heights blocked the stars, so that a navigator would read the sky by what was not there as much as by what was. The pilots of those ships knew the stars the way a reader knows letters, immediately and without having to think, and they would have stood at the stern in the hours of darkness, with the wind in their hair, reading the night sky and making their small adjustments, confident in a knowledge that took a lifetime to acquire and will never quite be replicated now. There is something very quiet about a fleet of ships at night on open water. The lamps aboard each vessel would have made small warm points of light, oil burning in clay cups, the flame lying down in the direction of travel as the ships moved, leaning always forward the way living things lean toward what they are moving toward. And from any one ship you can look out across the dark water and see the other lamps, dozens and hundreds of them, some near and some so far that they were barely distinguishable from the lower stars, and for a moment the sea and the sky would become one surface, covered in small lights, and the ships would feel as though they were sailing through something infinite and soft. Agamemnon, standing perhaps at the stern of his own ship in those night hours, would have seen all of this, the lights of his vast command spreading behind and beside him across the water, the coast of Troy somewhere ahead in the darkness, real and waiting. Whether he slept during those crossing nights, or whether sleep came reluctantly, turning away from him, as it sometimes does from men who carry large and complicated things, this we cannot know. The myths do not dwell on the crossing itself, only on what was left behind and what lay ahead. And so the passage through the Aegean becomes, in the imagination, a kind of threshold, a held breath between one world and another. But the wind kept its word, and the stars stayed where the pilots needed them, and the islands kept appearing and falling away, and the days and nights of crossing had their rhythm. The rowing when the wind slept, the sailing when it woke, the salt provisions and the water rationed, and the sound of the sea, constant and absolute in every waking moment. And slowly, the way all inevitable things arrive, the shape of a new coast began to assemble itself on the eastern horizon. Not today, perhaps not tomorrow as we drift here into sleep, but soon, the low brown hills, the plain, the distant glitter of something that was not the sea, the shores of Troy, patient and old, waiting as they had always waited, as all places wait for the things that history has decided will happen to them. Let the fleet sail on a little longer, through the quiet dark of the Aegean. Let the oil lamps lean forward in their small clay cups. Let the water carry everything gently eastward, and let all of that be enough for tonight, enough to hold in the mind as sleep comes. The lights on the water, the wind in the sails, the stars doing their ancient and reliable work overhead. The prows touched sand before the light had fully come. It is difficult now, lying in the quiet dark of wherever you are, to imagine what that shoreline must have looked like in the gray hour before dawn. 1,000 ships are near enough to it, easing forward through shallow water, the hulls grinding softly against the Trojan beach, and the sound of it carrying up the long slope toward the walls of a city that had been sleeping, perhaps, just moments before. The oars were shipped, the anchoring stones were lowered with a muffled splash, and then there was a moment. It is worth pausing here to feel it, a moment of extraordinary stillness, the whole vast armada simply resting on the water, breathing, the way a wave pauses at the very peak of its rise before it commits to the shore. The sea wind came in from the west that morning, as it so often did along that coast, carrying with it the smell of brine and something green and distant, the islands they had passed in the night, still faintly present in the air. The men in the ships would have smelled it without thinking, the way you stop noticing the smell of your own house. It was simply the smell of where they were now, the smell of the beginning of something that none of them could yet measure. The Trojan shore was not empty when the Greeks arrived. The stories tell us that the Trojans, or some of them, had come down to meet the landing, that there was fighting even in those first gray moments, that the sand was churned and the water clouded before the sun had properly risen. And yet the historians and the poets and the old accounts all move quickly past that first contact, as though even they could feel the enormous weight of what was to come, pressing the beginning thin, flattening those first hours into mere prelude. What matters more, for our purposes tonight, is what came after. What matters is the settling in, because they did settle in. That is perhaps the strangest and most human thing about the whole great enterprise. The way 10,000 men or more, soldiers and sailors and craftsmen and kings, gradually arranged themselves into something that resembled at its edges ordinary life. The camp grew. That is the simplest way to say it. It grew the way any inhabited place grows, through accumulation and habit, and the slow pressure of daily need. First there were the ships, drawn up along the beach in long rows, their prows facing the sea, as though they had not quite given up the idea of departure. Between and behind the ships, the tents went up, rough structures at first, skins stretched over wooden frames, barely enough to keep the night wind off, and then as weeks became months, and months whispered of something longer, more permanent things began to appear. Huts of timber and mud brick, lean toes built against the hulls of the ships themselves, cooking fires that burned in the same spot, evening after evening, until the earth around them was black and hard and permanent as stone. The smell of wood smoke became the constant undertone of everything, worked into clothing and hair and the wood of the ships, until you could not separate the camp from the fire that sustained it, the two things breathing together like a single creature. The Greeks had brought what they could carry, and what they could trade for, and what they could take from the surrounding country. The Troad, that wide, gently rolling land around Troy, was rich enough in grain and cattle and timber, and the villages and farms that lay beyond the city walls were not always swift enough to move their stores before Greek foraging parties arrived. It is said that Agamemnon and the other kings organized these expeditions carefully, because a hungry army is no army at all, and because the discipline of supply is the invisible architecture that holds a campaign upright, even when everything else is uncertain. The men who tended the fires and counted the jars of oil, and salted the meat and mended the ships, those men mattered as much as the ones who carried spears, and the great king would have known it. What did the days feel like in that long and grinding first year? The mornings would have begun with the sea, always the sea, its sound arriving before the light did, the low rhythmic exhalation of it against the beach, carrying into sleep, and then up through the thin membrane between sleeping and waking. Men rose with the dawn because there was no particular reason not to, and the first business of the day was fire. Not the metaphorical fire of ambition or anger or any of the things the poets would later make of those years, but the literal, practical, daily fire. Kindling coaxed from damp wood, breath blown carefully into orange coals, the smell of smoke mixing with salt air in a combination that, after long enough, would come to feel like home. Food, the grinding of grain if there was grain, the skinning of an animal if the foragers had been fortunate, the heating of water in clay pots for whatever could be made from what was at hand. There is something very old and very quiet in that image. Men at a campfire in the early morning, waiting for something to become warm, not thinking yet about Troy or glory or the years ahead of them, simply waiting, as people have always waited over fire, for the next small thing to be ready. The walls of Troy stood perhaps a comfortable walk away, close enough to see on a clear day, far enough that the city lived its own life largely beyond reach. The Trojans did not simply wait inside their walls, of course. There were sorties, encounters, the constant low friction of two armed communities forced into proximity. But in those early years, the story suggests, neither side had yet found the full shape of what the conflict would become. There were negotiations, it is said. There were periods of relative quiet. There was the strange social life of a siege, where enemies who could not yet defeat each other sometimes came close enough to speak, to study one another, to develop the odd intimacy that prolonged opposition creates. For Agamemnon, those early years carried the particular weight of command, not the vivid momentary weight of battle, but the duller, more constant weight of being the man that other men looked to. He had brought this coalition together through persuasion and obligation, and the sheer force of his position as the most powerful king in Greece. He held it together now through the same means, complicated by distance and time, and the slow erosion that comes when great men are required to wait. The other kings were proud, every one of them, with their own followings, their own grievances, their own sense of what they deserved. Managing all of that, keeping the thing moving forward without letting it collapse inward on itself, was a task without glory and without end. It was in its way a kind of siege within the siege. The evenings, at least, had a gentleness to them. The light over the Aegean at evening is a particular kind of light, long and golden, and somehow melancholy in the way that beautiful things often are when you are far from where you love. The sea would catch it and hold it, the water going from blue to a deep burnished copper, and the fires of the camp would rise and answer as the sun went down, so that for a little while the shore burned with two kinds of light at once, the one dying and the other just beginning. Men would gather around those fires, the way men always have, and talk, and eat what there was to eat, and listen to whatever music or story was available, and the day would gradually become night, without any sharp boundary between them. This is the rhythm that settled over the Greek camp in those first years, the rhythm not of heroism but of endurance, of days accumulating into something no one had quite planned for, the adventure hardening slowly into something more like work, more like patience, more like the long and unremarkable practice of simply continuing. The sea was always there at the edge of it, marking time in its own patient way, indifferent to the reasons men had come to this shore or how long they intended to stay. And somewhere in those days, the days were beginning to add up into something that would take years to complete, something that the men on the beach could not yet see the shape of, even as they were already living inside it. As you let your breath slow now and the sounds of your own night settle around you, you might carry with you into sleep the image of those fires along the Trojan shore, burning gold against the dark water, the sea wind moving through them gently, bending the flames without putting them out. Tomorrow we will wander a little deeper into the life of that camp, into the alliances and the tensions, and the particular difficulty of being a high king among men who have never been easy to lead. But for now, the fires burn low, and the sea breathes quietly, and there is nothing that cannot wait until morning. The fires along the shore had been burning for years by now, and the men who tended them no longer thought very much about it. There is something that happens to human beings when a long effort stretches itself out across seasons, and then years, when what began as a great urgent thing settles slowly into the grain of ordinary life. And the Greek camp at Troy had undergone exactly that transformation in the quiet, grinding way that only time can accomplish. The tents had become structures. The cooking fires had found their permanent places in the sand. The pathways between the ships and the supply stores had been worn into something almost like roads, packed hard by the feet of thousands of men, moving back and forth in the rhythms of a life that was not quite a soldier's life and not quite anything else. A life suspended, as it were, between the world they had left behind and the world that had not yet arrived. And at the center of all of this, not quite like a king in his palace, and not quite like a general in the field, moved Agamemnon, son of Atreus, high king of Mycenae, lord of the golden citadel, the man whom all these other great men had agreed, each in his own complicated way, to follow. To understand what that agreement actually meant in the world of Bronze Age Greece, it helps to sit quietly for a moment with the nature of the thing, to let it settle into focus the way the eye slowly adjusts to a dimmer room. Agamemnon was not a king above all other men. He was more precisely a king above all other kings, and the distinction matters enormously, because every one of the men who had sailed with him, Odysseus from his rocky island of Ithaca, Diomedes from Argos, Ajax from Salamis, Idomeneus from Crete, great Achilles from Phthia in the north, every one of them was himself a ruler, a man accustomed to deference, a man whose word within his own domain was absolute and unchallengeable. They had brought their own ships, their own men, their own provisions, their own pride. They had come not as subjects to a master, but as allies to a common cause, and the common cause was the only thing that technically bound them together at all. This is the world Agamemnon had to navigate every single day on the shore of Troy, and the scholars and poets who have thought about him longest tend to agree that it was, in many ways, the truest and most demanding labor of his life. It is one thing to command men who have no choice but to obey. It is quite another to lead men who know with absolute clarity that they could leave. Odysseus could have sailed home to Ithaca at any moment. Achilles could have withdrawn to his ships, as indeed he eventually would. Idomeneus and his Cretans were not chained to the Troad by anything except their own honor and their own sense of obligation. And honor, as any man of that world understood perfectly well, could be satisfied in several different directions. The art that Agamemnon had to practice then was not the art of command in the simple sense of the word. It was something more like the art of holding, of maintaining the coherence of a thing that was always, always on the edge of coming apart. And he was not always good at it. This much the tradition preserves quite honestly, and there is something almost comforting in that honesty, in the way the old stories do not bother to pretend that the High King was a perfect diplomat or a man of inexhaustible patience. He was proud. He had been raised to be proud, trained by birth and by circumstance, and by the simple fact of ruling the richest kingdom in the Greek world, to understand himself as first among these men, and sometimes that pride expressed itself in ways that made the already difficult work of coalition harder than it needed to be. There are accounts, fragmented and uncertain in their details, of councils on the beach that grew heated, of words exchanged in the firelight that were not quite forgiven in the morning, of smaller kings who felt themselves slighted and retired to their own sections of the camp in a cold silence that Agamemnon's advisors then had to work carefully and patiently to thaw. Nestor of Pylos was perhaps the most valuable of those advisors, the old king whose age had given him a kind of authority that existed outside the usual hierarchies of power and pride. It is said that when the councils became fractious, it was often Nestor's voice that found its way through the noise, not because he commanded anyone, but because his great age implied a depth of experience that made the younger men pause and listen, the way one pauses instinctively at the edge of a sound that seems to be coming from very far away. He had known Agamemnon's father's time and his father's father's time, and the weight of all that remembered history gave him a useful kind of gravity in the space between proud men. Agamemnon, to his considerable credit, generally listened to Nestor, even when listening required him to soften a position he had taken publicly, and which he might have been excused for defending past the point of wisdom. Odysseus served a different function in the web of the coalition, and the old stories are unanimous in their appreciation of it. Where Nestor offered the calm authority of remembered precedent, Odysseus offered something more nimble, an ability to read the particular mood of a particular moment and respond to it in the way most likely to produce the outcome that was needed, which was almost always some version of continued unity. He was a man who understood that the truth could be presented in several different arrangements without ceasing to be the truth, and that the arrangement you chose on any given occasion mattered enormously to whether the men listening to you walked away willing to keep fighting, or walked away nursing a grievance that would harden overnight into something much more difficult to address. Agamemnon needed Odysseus, and the story goes he knew it, which is itself a kind of wisdom, the wisdom of understanding what you do not yourself possess. The alliances within the camp had their textures and their seasons. Some were warm and seemed to rest on genuine mutual regard. Agamemnon's relationship with Diomedes is often described in the old accounts with a quality of straightforward respect. Two men who understood each other's capabilities without envy and were content to let each other be excellent in their own way, which in a camp full of heroes was not as common a quality as one might hope. Others were more formal, alliances maintained through the deliberate exchange of gifts and honors and the public acknowledgement of status that meant so much to men of that world. The Cretan contingent under Idomeneus was large and capable and proud of both facts, and it is said that Agamemnon was always careful in his dealings with the Cretans, always precise in his allocation of their share of honor, understanding that a slight to Idomeneus was a slight to every man who had sailed from that ancient island, and that ancient islands have very long memories. And then there was Achilles, who was a chapter entirely by himself, and whom we will come to in his own time, but who even in these quieter years before the great quarrel was a presence that shaped the texture of the camp the way a very large stone shapes the current of a river around it. Everyone knew where Achilles was, everyone knew what Achilles was doing, and Agamemnon, for all his pride, was not blind to the fact that the son of Peleus was the finest warrior in the army, and possibly the finest warrior who had ever lived, which created a tension in the High King that he managed with varying degrees of success. The tension between meeting someone and being unwilling to simply say so, between authority and gratitude, between the role he had to play and the reality he had to live inside. In the evenings, when the councils were finished, and the fires had settled into their long, slow burning, and the sound of the Aegean moved in its ancient rhythmic way against the dark shore, Agamemnon would sometimes sit outside his tent, it is said, and look out toward the walls of Troy, those high, pale walls, still standing after all these years, and there was something in his face in those moments that the men who were there remembered afterward as very far from triumph, very far from certainty, and much more like the expression of a man who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has simply become accustomed to the weight of it. He was the High King. He held the coalition together through pride and patience and the help of wiser men and the slow daily labor of leadership in a place where every morning had to be earned. The sea wind moved through the camp, salt, cool, and indifferent, carrying the smell of cook-fire smoke across the years of the long siege, and somewhere in the darkness, the watchfires held their small, steady light against the night. Dust had settled over the Greek camp by the time the 9th year of the war arrived, drifting down from the dry hills behind Troy in fine gray curtains that coated everything. The ropes of the ships, the leather of the tents, the bronze of 1,000 shields leaning idle against their poles. The sea, as ever, lay to the west, its horizon a pale and steady line, the sound of it continuous and low, like the breathing of something enormous that paid no attention at all to the quarrels of men. And it is in that dust, in that 9th year, that we find the story of Agamemnon and Achilles beginning to come apart. Not all at once, not in a single bright moment of fury, but slowly the way a thread in fine cloth loosens over many seasons of wearing, pulling one loop at a time, until one morning you hold the fabric up to the light and see clearly that it was never as whole as you believed. The story goes that it began with a priest. His name was Chryses, and he served the god Apollo, and he came to the Greek shore in the early morning, the sea fog still unburned from the water, carrying in his old hands the golden staff and the sacred ribbons of his god. He had come to ask for his daughter, Chryseis, who had been taken in one of the Greeks' many raids along the Anatolian coast and given as a prize to Agamemnon himself. The priest offered ransom. It is said he offered a great deal of it, and the Greeks who heard him were inclined toward mercy, inclined toward the quiet respectfulness that one owed a man who walked under Apollo's protection. Inherited, constructed, maintained through alliance and ceremony and the slow accumulation of obligation, Achilles' authority was purely personal, sprung from his extraordinary ability in battle and from the absolute confidence he carried in his own nature. He did not need to be High King because he did not need anyone else's acknowledgement to know what he was. This made him, in Agamemnon's world, deeply uncomfortable company. A man whose worth requires no external confirmation is a man who cannot easily be controlled, and Agamemnon had always understood, even if only in the wordless chambers of his instinct, that his position rested on others choosing to recognize it. The assembly came to its conclusion gently enough, or might have. A prophet named Calchas rose and explained the plague, explained the priest, explained what restitution Apollo required. He asked for protection before he spoke, fearing the wrath of powerful men, and Achilles gave it to him. This, too, was a small adjustment of the tension between them, Achilles offering his protection in an assembly where Agamemnon was nominally supreme, the implication hanging in the salt air without anyone naming it directly. Agamemnon agreed to return the girl. He did agree, but he did so with the particular graciousness of a man who has never quite learned to give without immediately taking, and he made it clear as he spoke that the loss of Chryseis must be compensated, that a king could not be seen to simply surrender a prize without receiving another in its place. He was owed, he said. He was owed by the assembled Greeks. His eye, as the story goes, settled on Achilles, and here is where the thread pulled in a way it could not be pulled back through. Achilles had Briseis. She was a young woman taken from Lyrnessos, a city the Greeks had burned in one of the early years of the campaign, and she had been awarded to Achilles as his prize, the proper recognition of his effort and his excellence. She was not merely property in the cold, modern sense we might imagine. She was, in the economy of honor that these men breathed and ate and slept inside, a sign, a visible, walking, breathing sign that Achilles had done what men most valued, and had been seen to do it, and had been properly recognized. To take her back was not simply to remove a person. It was to unmake the recognition. It was to say in front of every king and captain on that shore that what had been given could be taken, that Achilles' honor was subject to Agamemnon's convenience. Achilles said so. He said so at length and with the kind of clarity that can only come from someone who has never learned, or never needed, to soften truth for the sake of a room's comfort. He pointed out that he had come to Troy for no quarrel of his own. His people, the Myrmidons, had no ancient grievance against Priam's city. He had come because of the obligations woven between kings, because Agamemnon had asked, and he had fought longer and harder than nearly any other man on the plain, and his reward for all of it was to have his honor stripped from him in public, to soothe the proud man's discomfort. Agamemnon, to his cost, could not hear any of this except as a challenge to his primacy. There is something almost sorrowful in watching it, the way the story unfolds from this point. Two men, both of them necessary, both of them genuinely great in their different modes. One the supreme institutional authority, without whom the coalition has no center. The other the supreme fighting excellence, without whom the campaign has no sharpest edge, and neither of them equipped by nature or history to yield even slightly in the direction of the other. Agamemnon could not acknowledge Achilles' complaint without feeling that he was admitting a weakness in his claim to command. Achilles could not absorb the insult and remain in service without becoming, in his own estimation, less than what he was. So Briseis was taken. The heralds came to Achilles' tent with visible reluctance, it is said, and Achilles gave the girl over without violence, speaking to the heralds gently, because he understood that they were only instruments of another man's decision and did not deserve his anger. But he withdrew. He went to the shore, the great sea, always there to receive whatever a person brought to it. And he sat with his grief and his fury and his sense of profound injustice, and he did not fight. He would not fight for a very long time. The Greeks would feel his absence, in the way that a room feels the absence of its central fire. Still standing, still functional in all its outward dimensions, but cold in a way that no supplementary warmth quite corrected. And Agamemnon would carry the cost of his own pride forward into the middle years of the war, making decisions without the counsel and the sword arm he had so carelessly discarded, learning in the long, slow way of stubborn men that authority and excellence are not the same inheritance, and that one cannot replace the other simply by insisting loudly enough that it should. The dust continued to settle on the camp. The sea continued its steady conversation with the shore, and the fires of the Greek watchposts burned through the night, smaller somehow, or so it must have seemed to men lying awake in their tents, listening to the quiet and thinking of home. In the middle years that followed, the world of the siege would settle into its long, grinding patience. Days of dust and small engagements, the smell of the sea and the campfire, blurring into a single continuous sensation. Time losing its edges until the war felt less like a campaign, and more like a kind of weather that one simply lived inside. And through all of it, the absence of Achilles lay over the plain like a shadow, waiting, as shadows do, for the light to shift. The dust never truly settled. It hung in the air between the tents, between the cook fires and the wagon wheels, and the feet of men who had long since stopped counting the days. And it coated everything with a pale, chalky film that tasted faintly of the plain itself, of dried grass and sun-baked earth, and the mineral dryness of a land that had never asked them to come. You could see it on the men's forearms in the afternoon, on the rims of their bronze cups, on the folded cloaks they used for pillows, on the horses' flanks, where sweat had dried and dried again into long, pale streaks. The dust of the Trojan plain was its own kind of presence, quiet and patient and utterly without urgency, as though the land itself had decided simply to wait them out. And still the walls stood. They rose at the edge of vision in the middle distance, massive and pale against the sky, Troy's great towers catching the morning light and holding it in a way that could seem almost beautiful if you let yourself look at them without remembering what they meant. The men in the camp had stopped looking, mostly. After the first year, after the second, after the third slow turning of seasons that each arrived and departed without resolution, the walls had become simply a feature of the horizon, no more remarkable to the eye than the ridge of hills beyond or the distant shimmer of the sea. The eye registers what is always there differently than it registers what is new, and Troy had ceased to be new a very long time ago. The sea, though, the sea was always present. You could not look away from it even when you tried, because it was the direction of home, and home had become the great unnamed ache of the camp, spoken of in oblique ways, in the particular silence that fell over a group of men when someone mentioned the olive groves on a hillside back in Argos, or the smell of a particular harbor at dawn, or the way his wife had stood at the gate when he left. Home was everywhere and nowhere in the camp, a ghost that moved between the tents at night when the fires burned low and the watchmen stood at their posts staring out at nothing in particular. The rhythm of the siege was slow and had long since become automatic. Dawn brought the stiffness of sleeping on packed earth, the drawing on of armor that had been donned so many thousands of times that the hands moved without thought, buckle by buckle, strap by strap. The fires were built up from embers and the morning meal was whatever there was. Salted fish, coarse bread, whatever could be hunted or traded, or brought in from the supply ships that arrived irregularly from the islands and the coast. The smell of morning in the camp was smoke and unwashed wool, and the salt wind coming off the water, cutting through everything else, always present, arriving from the direction of home. The men had built their camp into something that was no longer quite a camp exactly. It had acquired the slow permanences of any human settlement, given enough time and enough necessity. There were storage buildings with thatched roofs that sagged and had been repaired and sagged again. There were paths worn so deeply between certain points that they had become a kind of road. There were places that had become, by common unspoken agreement, the place where this thing happened and the place where that thing happened, where the commander's tents stood, where the horses were kept, where the wounded were brought, where the ships were beached in their long rows. The ships themselves had changed. Their hulls had been patched so many times that they were barely the same ships that had crossed from Aulis. And yet they were still somehow the same ships, still carrying in their grain and salt-darkened wood some memory of the crossing, of the wind that had finally come. The watchfires were lit each evening as the light failed, a long chain of them along the perimeter of the camp, and the men who tended them were part of a rotation so established that everyone knew without being told whose night it was, whose turn it was to sit beside the flames and watch the dark. It is said that the soldiers developed, in those long middle years, a particular relationship with fire, not the fire of battle or sacrifice, but this quiet, ordinary fire, the fire that simply kept the darkness manageable, that held back the strange, amplified fears that darkness brings to men far from home. They fed the fires with driftwood and scrub brush, and sometimes with the broken wood of things that had worn out and could not be repaired. And the fires burned with varying colors depending on what was given to them. Salt-bleached wood burning with a faint blue edge at its heart, dry brush crackling and spitting, and all of it rising in thin pale columns into a sky that was almost always clear and always full of stars. The stars were what the men talked about at night, in the way that men talk about things they cannot change and find, in that very unchangeability, a kind of comfort. The stars came out in their familiar patterns and moved in their slow arcs as they had always moved and would always move, indifferent to the war below, indifferent to Troy and to Greece alike. And there was something in that indifference that was almost restful if you held it in a certain way. The men had names for the patterns that had been passed down to them from their fathers and their fathers' fathers, and on slow nights they traced them with their fingers in the air above the watchfires, the hunter and the bear and the great river and the cluster of sisters, all of them moving so slowly you could not see them move, and yet moving. Days blurred into each other in the grinding middle years, and yet each day was full of its small particulars, its small textures, the sound of hammering from the smiths who were always repairing something, a hinge on a shield, a crack in a greave, the iron rim of a wheel, the sound of horses, their breathing and their heavy footfalls, their occasional inexplicable shifts of mood that required someone to go to them and speak quietly and lay a hand on their warm necks. The sound of water being poured, which was one of the most ordinary and yet somehow most comforting sounds of the camp. The sound of a clay jug being lifted and tilted, and the water falling into a bowl, the sound of ordinary morning, at certain times of year, of rain on the tent canvas, which brought its own complicated feelings, relief from the dust, the smell of wetted earth that was so achingly close to the smell of home, and yet also mud, and the particular misery of armor left too long in wet air. Agamemnon moved through these days as the High King moved through all days, which is to say with the particular weight of command settled so thoroughly over his shoulders that it had become invisible, or nearly so, The decisions of each day were made from this or that seat, in this or that configuration, councils that had long since lost whatever initial formality they might once have possessed, and had settled into the comfortable and sometimes contentious rhythms of men who know each other too well. He knew the faces of his commanders in every light and mood. He knew what the silence of one meant and the easy words of another. He had learned the siege the way a man learns a difficult piece of ground, every hollow of it, every place where the footing was uncertain. And the walls still stood, and the sea lay to the west, and the dust settled on everything, slowly and without haste, the way time itself was settling over the plain, covering each day as it passed with a thin, pale film, through which the outlines of things remained visible, but somehow softened, somehow made more remote. There would come a time, still some way off, in the slow drift of these years, when the waiting would end. It is difficult, lying inside the endlessness of a long middle, to believe that any middle ever truly ends. And yet they do, and there are always signs in the days just before the ending, a subtle shift in the quality of the air, a change in the way men hold themselves at evening, a feeling like the feeling that comes before a weather change, when the wind turns, and brings something different with it from out over the water. But that turning was not yet, for now there was only the plain, and the walls, and the fires, and the slow breathing of the camp around the small hours of the night, and the stars moving their imperceptible course above everything, and the sea lying dark and silver out to the west, holding its own long patience, salt and cold, and endlessly, quietly present. Let the fires keep their watch a little longer, and let all of this rest in the dark. The fires had been burning for a long time before anyone truly believed it was over. Not the fires of battle, which had come and gone across 10 long years in rhythms the Greek soldiers had learned to read the way farmers read the sky, but the fires of the city itself, the great consuming orange light that rose from within the walls of Troy and did not stop, that sent its columns of black smoke up into the night air above the plain of Ilium until the whole horizon to the east was the color of a forge, until the smell of burning cedar and burning wool and burning olive wood drifted all the way down to the shore, where the ships were beached, and the men who had sailed from every corner of Greece a decade ago stood in the sand and looked at what they had done, and felt, it is said, something far more complicated than joy. It had come at last through patience and through cunning, as the great things so often do, not with a single heroic stroke, but with a long, careful accumulation of moments. The hollow belly of the wooden horse, the silence inside it, the breathing of men in the dark. The story goes that the horse was dragged through the Scaean gates by the Trojans themselves, that there was celebration in the streets of the city that night, that the lamps were lit and wine was poured, and the people of Troy believed, for a few luminous hours, that the long nightmare of the siege had finally lifted, that the Greek ships visible from the walls had truly gone, that peace had come sailing back across the water to them at last. It is said there was music, that there was the sound of singing in the upper city, and that the fires the Trojans lit that night in gladness were the same fires that the men slipping out from the horses' hollow flanks used to guide each other through the dark streets when the city had finally grown quiet and the wine had done its work and Troy slept its last untroubled sleep. Agamemnon would have watched from the ships. That is where the High King would have been in those last hours, standing or perhaps sitting on the prow of his vessel, his great cloak pulled around him against the night air that came cold off the water, even in the warm season, watching the glow that grew slowly at first, and then with a terrible authority above the walls. He had waited 10 years for this light. He had sacrificed everything for it, in ways both literal and not. He had quarreled and reconciled and quarreled again, had watched men he knew and respected die in the dust before those walls, had sent messengers and received insults, had dragged the coalition together again and again when it threatened to splinter under the weight of its own pride and exhaustion, and now the light was there. Now Troy was burning, and the weariness in him, one imagines, must have been so profound, so deep in the bone, that the feeling which came was less triumph than simply the ending of a great pressure, the way a man exhales at last after holding his breath in a dark place for longer than he thought possible. The Greek soldiers moved through the streets of Troy in that strange half-dark that fire makes, that orange and shadow world where familiar shapes become strange and strange shapes become familiar. The city that had existed for them for 10 years only as a silhouette, as a set of walls and towers seen always from a distance, was now something they moved through, something with alleyways and courtyards and threshold stones and painted doorposts, something that had been full of ordinary life until very recently. There would have been the smell of it, smoke of course, always smoke, and beneath that the smell of a city, of cooking and storage jars and the particular warm smell of inhabited rooms, of lamps burning olive oil, that oil and wick smell that had been present in every home and palace and temple across the whole of the Mediterranean world, that steady burning light that meant people lived here, that meant warmth and shelter and the small ceremonies of domestic life. And now that smell was mixing with the smell of ruin, and the men who had waited so long for this moment were walking through something that had been a home to 10,000 people. And whatever they were feeling, the ancient stories suggest that even among the victors, there was something that was not simple, something that an honest man might have had trouble naming, but that settled over the city that night like the smoke itself, pervasive, gray, impossible to avoid. The great stones of Troy did not burn, of course. Walls of that thickness, that antiquity, those dressed and fitted limestone blocks that had been laid by hands long dead before even the war began. Those remained standing when the wooden things were consumed, when the roof beams came down and the upper story surrendered to the fire, and the great palace rooms opened to the sky for the first time in their long existence. The stones remained, and it is in the nature of stone to be patient, to hold its heat for a long time after the flame has passed, to radiate a slow warmth that in the darkness feels almost tender, almost like something alive. The walls of Troy, when the morning came and the fire had done what it intended, would have still been warm to the touch, and the men moving among them in the first gray light would have found a silence that was nothing like peace, a silence that was simply the absence of everything that had filled that place, a city-shaped emptiness, a space where 10 years of an enemy's life had been carried on and was now simply gone. The morning after is often the quietest moment in any great story, and this one is no different. The light came up in the east, that pale, indifferent light of the Aegean dawn that does not alter itself for human events, that falls with the same even quality on ashes and on flowering fields, on the wreckage of great things and on things still whole and undisturbed. The plain of Ilium would have been quiet. The sounds of the previous night, the shouting, the terrible sounds that accompany the fall of a city, settled now into something like stillness. The smoke still rose, thinner in the morning air, drifting toward the sea. The sea was there, as it always was, as it had been there every single day of 10 years, that constant presence at the edge of the plain, that gray-blue expanse that the men could smell from wherever they stood. The brine and the openness of it, the reminder that they had come from somewhere else and that somewhere else still existed, waiting. Agamemnon would have walked, perhaps, through what remained. A high king makes his accounting, notes what has been achieved, stands in the ruin of a great enemy's city, and understands that this is now part of his story, part of what will be said about him in the years to come, in the great halls of Greece, where men sit late around the fire and tell the tales of what was done in the generation of heroes. He had led the greatest coalition of kings that the Greek world had ever assembled, across the wide water, to the most famous city of his age, and Troy was fallen. It is difficult to imagine what that felt like from the inside, to have carried that burden for a decade, and to be now on the other side of it. Perhaps it did not feel like anything very specific at all. Perhaps it felt like the morning always feels. Gray and quiet and a little cold, smelling of salt and smoke, the body tired, the mind somewhere between waking and a deeper kind of sleep. The ships needed to be made ready. There were men to account for, spoils to divide, gods to thank or appease, the rituals that follow every ending and that give the hand something to do while the mind is still finding its way back from the place it has been. The shore was alive with the business of men preparing to leave, and the business of preparation is its own kind of mercy, its own way of moving forward when standing still would be too much. And the sea was there as ever, receiving the smoke and the silence with equal indifference, rocking gently against the hulls of the beached ships, those 1,000 ships that had carried so much hope and ambition across the Aegean a decade ago, and that would now carry these changed and weathered men back in the other direction, westward, toward home. The water caught the morning light and held it, broken into 1,000 small shifting pieces, the way lamplight breaks and scatters on the surface of a bowl of oil, that warm and wavering glow that is not one steady flame, but many smaller ones, each separate, each still burning. The way home is long, and the sea that looks so familiar is full of things that patience alone cannot prepare a man for. But that journey belongs to the next night's telling, and for now, the fire has burned down to its embers, and the smoke drifts toward the water, and it is enough to rest. The fires of Troy were behind him now. They had burned for days after the city fell, those great columns of smoke rising into the late summer sky like signals sent to gods who had long since grown tired of watching. And Agamemnon had stood among them, among the ruins and the silence and the strange hollow feeling that follows the end of something enormous, and had known, as perhaps all commanders know in such moments, that the war itself had been the easier thing to endure. It is the return that undoes men. It is the open water between the place where great deeds were done and the place where ordinary life must somehow be resumed that carries its own particular weight, heavier in some ways than bronze armor, heavier than the long years of siege, because there is nothing left to do but feel it all at once, alone on the shifting surface of the sea. The Aegean was vast and indifferent in the way that only the sea can be, a gray and silver expanse stretching northward and westward toward home, raked by autumn winds that had begun to carry the first cool breath of the season that was turning. It is said that the gods were not at peace after Troy, that the sacking of the city and the violence done within its temples had unsettled something in the divine order that governs the relationship between men and the immortals, and that the Greek fleet carried this unsettlement with it like a cargo it had not chosen to load. The story goes that Athena herself, who had been so fierce and tireless a friend to the Greek cause through all the years of war, had turned her face away, troubled by what had been done in her sacred precincts during those last terrible hours, when the city was taken, and ordinary men, exhausted and triumphant, and no longer quite themselves, had forgotten the obligations that even war imposes upon those who wish to sail home safely. Agamemnon's fleet moved across that water in the slow and uncertain way of great things whose purpose has been completed and whose next shape is not yet clear. There were many ships still, though fewer than the 1,000 that had crossed in the other direction 10 years before, the losses of a decade of war thinning their number in ways that no one counted aloud, because the counting was its own kind of grief. The men who sailed them were changed men, brown and lean and quiet in the way of those who have seen too much over too long a time, and the sea they sailed through was the same sea it had always been, indifferent to their weariness, indifferent to their victory, asking only that they attend to ropes and oars and the reading of wind. The winds were not always kind. It is said that storms rose up in those weeks of crossing, not the sudden violent squalls that come in any season, but something more sustained and purposeful. Restlessness in the water that spoke of divine displeasure without announcing its source, and that ships were separated from one another in the gray confusion of wave and spray, losing sight of their companions, finding themselves alone on a sea that suddenly seemed much larger than it had before. Some fleets were blown far off their course, the story goes, driven onto rocky shores, or carried southward toward coasts they had not intended to visit, and the homecoming that had seemed so close, so solid after all those years of waiting for it, became something provisional and uncertain, dependent on the mercy of weather and the attentiveness of men who were tired in their very bones. Agamemnon himself held his course as best he could, the great king of Mycenae, the lord of the golden citadel, the commander of all those kings, now scattered across the face of the returning sea. There is something striking, something that carries its own quiet melancholy, in imagining him in those days, standing at the prow of his ship in the salt wind, looking westward where the sky darkened each evening, into the deep blue of late afternoon, and then into the early dark of autumn nights, thinking, perhaps, of Mycenae, of its walls, of the smell of the place, that particular combination of stone and olive wood and lamp smoke and the dry hillside herbs that grew in the cracks of the great stones, the smell that is home and that no other place in the world smells quite like. He would have been in those hours on the open water, whatever the king had covered over during the long years of the war, just a man going home, carrying with him everything that had happened, and uncertain, as all returning men are uncertain, about what he would find waiting. The sea at night on those crossings must have been a particular kind of beautiful and a particular kind of strange. The Aegean in autumn turns dark early, and the stars that wheel above its surface are very bright, very numerous, and very far away, and men who have spent years hearing the sounds of a great siege, the distant percussion of battle, the low roar of thousands of voices, the creak of wood and the ring of bronze, find themselves suddenly enclosed in a silence that is not quite silence, but only the sound of water and wind, eternal and unhurried. It is said that sailors read the stars carefully on those nights, navigating by the old constellations that Bronze Age Greeks knew, as well as they knew the faces of their families, following the turning heavens like a map written in light across the dark, and that in the gaps between the work of navigation there was time, perhaps too much time, to think. There were omens, or what were understood to be omens, in the way that troubled men find meaning in everything the world offers them when they are uncertain. A flight of birds seen too early in the wrong part of the sky, a wave larger than the others that struck the hull with a sound that no one could quite explain and then was gone. The way the wind shifted at a particular hour, backing from one quarter to another, in a manner that the old sailors among the crew frowned at and would not speak of directly. Whether these things were truly signs, or whether they were the ordinary language of the sea translated by anxious minds into the vocabulary of prophecy, we cannot now say with any certainty. But it is true that the story of this voyage has always carried within it a sense of something waiting, something that the sea was holding in silence for the moment when land was reached, and the ship was made fast, and the long journey was finally, irrevocably, over. And yet the sea gave him back his life, at least for a little while longer. The storms passed, as storms do, and the gray water flattened into something calmer, and the coast of the mainland appeared on the horizon the way it always appears after a long crossing, first as a smudge, then as a shape, then gradually as something specific and known, the familiar contours of a landscape that belongs to you, that you belong to, resolving themselves out of the haze of distance into the actual, solid, present world. The smell of land reaches a sailor before the land itself is clearly seen. The particular dry warmth of a hillside carried on the offshore breeze, the faint trace of pine resin and wild thyme, and the dusty late summer earth of the Greek mainland. And it is a smell that after 10 years away must have struck the men of that fleet like something from a dream half remembered, something so deeply buried in the body's memory that it surfaced before the mind quite understood what it was sensing. The coast of the Peloponnese drew nearer with each hour of careful sailing, and Mycenae, that golden city on its high hill, its lion gate and its massive walls and its deep hearth fires, was only a short distance inland now, a matter of days, then hours, then a breath away from the present moment. The ships found their harbor, and the anchors went down with the dull, familiar sound of iron finding the soft seafloor, and the long voyage was over, and the land was solid beneath his feet again after all that water, all that open, uncertain sky, all those weeks of being entirely at the mercy of wind and wave, and whatever the gods had decided about the fate of men who had done what he had done. The sea was behind him now, flat and silver in the last light, reflecting the pale colors of the evening sky, quiet in the way the sea is quiet when it has finished with you, when it has given you back to the earth, and has no more to say. The lamps of the harbor settlement were beginning to come on one by one in the darkening air, small, warm lights against the settling dusk, and somewhere up on that high hill the great palace waited, and the people of Mycenae, and everything that home means, and everything that home costs, and the end of all journeys, which is never quite what we imagined when we were still at sea, dreaming of it. Rest now, gently. The water is behind him now. After everything, after the long gray corridors of the Aegean, after the storm-scattered fleet and the weeping shores of foreign places, after 10 years of Troy's dust settling into his skin like something permanent, the water is finally, quietly behind him. The ship that carried Agamemnon home has touched the coast of the Argolid, and the men who rowed the last miles in near silence have drawn their oars inward like the folded wings of a tired bird, and the hull has found the shore, and the king has stepped down onto the earth of home. It is late afternoon when he arrives, the story goes, or perhaps early morning. The ancient sources blur the light a little, as if even time itself wanted to soften the edges of this homecoming. What we can say is this: the air smells of thyme and warm stone, and the particular dryness of the Argive plain in summer, a smell so different from the salt-thick, ash-heavy air of the Trojan shore that it must have struck him like something almost painful. The body remembers what the mind has half forgotten, and the land of home, once felt underfoot again, is not simply a relief. It is a reckoning. He would have looked up toward Mycenae from the distance, as travelers always did. Even from the plain, the citadel asserts itself. The great walls rise from the hill like something grown rather than built, those enormous limestone blocks fitted together in a way that later Greeks would call Cyclopean, because surely they thought only giants could have moved such stones. In the long amber light of a Greek afternoon, those walls catch the color and hold it, and the whole citadel glows faintly, as it always has, as if something inside it is perpetually burning. He had seen that glow as a young man setting out. He sees it now, returning old. The procession from the shore to the citadel would have been a thing of ceremony, even after such a voyage, even after such exhaustion. There is a kind of formality that great men carry in their bones, a posture, a pace, a way of receiving the world that does not entirely relax, even when the heart is somewhere far away. Agamemnon would have walked as a king walks, upright and deliberate, with whatever retinue survived the journey gathered around him. The Trojan prophetess Cassandra, daughter of Priam, came with him. The story tells us this, though her presence adds a note of sorrow that hangs over the homecoming like incense smoke that will not clear. She had foreseen what waited. She had said so, in her way. No one had listened. No one ever did. The road up to the Lion Gate is not long, but it rises, and it narrows, and it requires intention. The great carved lions above the gate, or lionesses, as some scholars now believe, their heads long since worn to smoothness, watch the approach with that inscrutable animal patience that stone inherits from centuries. Agamemnon passed beneath them. He had done so before, many times, going and coming, in triumph and in need, but this passing is the one that myth remembers most completely, because this is the last one, and there is something in the quality of a last thing that we only recognize later, looking back, the way you only understand that a particular afternoon was the most beautiful afternoon of a whole summer, once the summer is gone. Clytemnestra received him. The story tells us that she was there, that she came forward to greet her husband with all the visible warmth of a queen welcoming home her lord after 10 years of separation. It is said that she prepared a bath for him, which was in those times a gesture of honor and care, the domestic ritual of welcome made intimate and personal. The great bronze vessels would have been filled, the water warmed over the kitchen fires, the lamplight arranged in that low, golden, breathing way that Mycenaean evenings always gathered it. Flame behind clay, warmth behind stone, everything interior and close. What passed between them in those first hours, we do not entirely know. The myth speaks mostly in outcomes. But we can imagine, and imagining gently, not dramatically, is what this night permits, that there was a conversation of surfaces. A queen who had governed alone for a decade, who had buried a daughter, who had built a life in the long absence of a husband she had once perhaps loved, and then perhaps not. A king who had commanded 10 years of siege, who had quarreled with great men and outlasted them, who had stood over the ruins of a city and felt something he perhaps could not name. Two people in the same room again after 10 years, each carrying a decade of interior weather the other has not witnessed. The lamplight would have moved on the walls. The smell of the bath, of warmed water and oil would have filled the air. Outside, the plain would have been settling into darkness. The first stars appearing above the walls, the same stars that had watched over Troy, indifferent and ancient, and unconcerned with any of it. The myth tells us what happened next in its own language, which is a language of symbol and consequence, rather than of precise sequence. Clytemnestra had been waiting, not simply in the ordinary sense of a wife awaiting a husband's return, but in the deeper, colder sense of a person who has decided upon something and has had 10 years to become certain of it. The killing of Iphigenia at Aulis, That unbearable decision her husband had made at the edge of a windless harbor so long ago had never left her. The story says it became the fixed star of her interior life, the point around which everything else organized itself. Aegisthus, her cousin and companion in the long absence, had his own reasons. Together, the story tells us, they had planned. Agamemnon died at Mycenae, in the citadel he had been born to, returned to, and given his life to holding. The exact manner of it, the myth tells in various ways across various poets. A robe that tangled, a bath, a sword, a moment of vulnerability after all those years of armored vigilance. The details shift a little from telling to telling, which is what happens to old stories as they pass through many mouths across many centuries. But the essential truth of it, as myth preserves it, is this. The most powerful king in the Greek world came home from the greatest war in Greek memory and did not survive his homecoming. And there is something in that, something that the ancient world sat with very quietly, not as a lesson exactly, but as a fact about the nature of things. That great effort does not guarantee safe return, that the dangers we imagine are often not the ones that find us, that home is never entirely the place we left. What we can rest with tonight is not the sorrow of the ending, but the long arc of the life that preceded it. The boy who lived in exile and learned to endure, the young man who climbed back toward this citadel with his brother and reclaimed what had been taken, the king who gathered 1,000 ships and held a coalition of proud, ungovernable men together for a decade across an impossible distance. The husband, the father, the commander, the figure who moved through one of the most turbulent stretches of the ancient world and left such an impression upon it that 3,000 years later, we are still speaking his name in the quiet hours before sleep. The lamps have burned down very low now, inside those Mycenaean rooms. The great hearth in the throne room, which has burned almost continuously for generations, is cooling to embers, red at the center and darkening at the edges, giving off a last slow heat that spreads across the floor and up the painted walls, where the frescoes catch it. Horses and sea creatures and processions of figures, all rendered in that particular style of the late Bronze Age, formal and alive at once. The lamplight ebbs, the stone holds the warmth a little while longer. Outside the plain is dark, and the stars are many, and the wind that always moves across the Argos at night is moving still, passing through the Lion Gate as it has for centuries, touching the worn stone threshold, continuing on. Tomorrow night, if you find your way back here, we will drift slowly through everything we have visited together. The salt air and the palace fires, the harbor at Aulis and the walls of Troy, the long voyage and the golden citadel, all of it gathered gently, like embers gathered before the last breath of a bellows, glowing one more time before they grow still. There is nothing urgent waiting, only the soft recollection of a long story, settling into rest. For now, the lamplight dims. The warmth of the stone is all around you. You can let the weight of this chapter go. The fire is very low now. You can hear it if you listen. The soft collapse of an ember somewhere deep in the coals. A small settling sound, like something that has been held upright for a very long time, finally choosing to rest. That is the sound of a story that has been fully told. Not ended, because stories like this one do not truly end. They simply grow quieter. They breathe more slowly. They find their way down through the layers of the night until they become something very close to a dream. And so let us drift back together, one last time, gently and without hurry, through everything we have visited in these long lamplit evenings. Let the images come loosely, the way they do when sleep is already beginning its slow work at the edges of the mind. We began at the very beginning of the world he came from, that ancient salt-edged world of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, where the sea was never far from anything, where the smell of wood smoke and olive oil and the faint mineral sharpness of bronze moved through every room of every palace like a presence. We let ourselves feel that world before we ever named a single person in it, because a man cannot be understood without his world, and Agamemnon's world was very old, very beautiful, and very serious. The light in those palaces was the light of oil lamps and open hearths, and it moved constantly, gilding one thing and then another, and we sat in it for a while and simply breathed. Then we went back even further, into the roots of the bloodline, into the story of Pelops, and the long chain of consequence that passed from generation to generation like something carried in the hands, carefully, because it was both a treasure and a burden that could not be put down. Agamemnon was born into a house that already had a history too heavy for any single life to carry lightly. He did not choose that history, as none of us choose the families we come from. But he carried it nonetheless, the way you carry the particular quality of light that belongs to the place where you were small. And then there were the years of exile, the childhood spent away from Mycenae, the years of shadow and displacement that the story goes were years of quiet endurance for two boys, Agamemnon and Menelaus, learning what it meant to be without the home that should have been theirs. There's something in that chapter that feels very human, very close, even across all those thousands of years. The particular longing of a child for something that was taken before he was old enough to understand why. The fire in those exile years was a borrowed fire, in borrowed rooms. And perhaps that is why, when Agamemnon finally came home to Mycenae, the fires of his own palace meant so much. And Mycenae itself, how beautiful it was, that city of gold and stone, felt the weight of those massive limestone blocks, fitted together by hands we will never know, looked out from a high citadel, over the plain below, and the faint silvered line of the distant sea. The lion gate stood, massive and calm. The hearth in the great hall breathed its fragrant smoke upward through the opening in the painted ceiling. The palace smelled of cedar oil and warm stone, and the faint sweetness of grain stored in the deep magazines below. That chapter was a dwelling in, and perhaps it is the one that returns most easily in sleep. The image of a great, warm, lamp-lit hall, solid and enduring, the city arranged around it like a prayer. Then came the rise to power, the reclaiming of what had been lost, and the strange, weighty thing that it is to be the most powerful king in all of Greece, to hold more ships than any other lord, to receive the tribute and the deference, and to carry in exchange a responsibility so large that it must sometimes have felt less like power and more like a kind of permanent debt. He wore that weight, the story goes, with something that was not quite ease, but was perhaps the competence that comes from having prepared for a thing your entire life. We spent a long time with Clytemnestra, with the complexity of their marriage, with the life they built together in Mycenae, before everything changed. She was never a simple figure, even in the years of relative peace. She was intelligent and capable, and fiercely present, and the palace was as much hers as his in those years, and the lamp that burned in the great hall burned equally for both of them. We lived a slow day inside a Mycenaean palace. We woke with the first fires of morning. We followed the rhythms of oil and grain and bronze and feasting and ceremony, and we let the sun cross the painted walls and the evening come down and the lamps be lit again one by one until the hall glowed warm and the day was done and the world felt very old and very peaceful. And then the world broke open. A guest violated the most sacred law of hospitality. A woman was taken from her home, and every oath sworn on the bones of horses by every lord in Greece pulled tight at once, drawing them all toward a distant shore they had never seen. The gathering of kings at Aulis was magnificent and terrifying. All those ships, all those proud men, all that bronze catching the light, and then the wind stopped. And in the stillness at Aulis, Agamemnon faced the most terrible thing a person can face, an impossible choice between two loves, two loyalties, two versions of himself. We told that chapter slowly and with great gentleness, and we let the mythic distance soften what needed softening, and we did not linger in the pain of it longer than was necessary. The winds came, the sails filled, 1,000 ships moved out across the Aegean under a sky vast and indifferent and full of cold stars, and the water was dark, and the oars dipped and rose, and the fleet breathed like a single preacher, crossing toward whatever was waiting. Troy, 10 years of Troy, the camp on the shore, the smell of campfire and sea wind, the long erosion of the siege. We felt the grinding quality of those years, the way endurance becomes its own kind of life, the way watchfires become familiar, the way even the most extraordinary circumstances eventually take on the texture of the ordinary. We sat with the tensions among the kings, with the quarrel that opened a wound so deep it nearly broke everything, with the pride and the cost of pride, and the long, slow work of learning that even the most powerful men are not sufficient alone. And then at last, after 10 years, The fire at Troy, not the warm fire of a palace hearth, but the fire of ending, the fire that meant the war was over, told quietly, with the weariness that belongs to the completion of very long and costly things. The silence after that fire was very large. The smoke drifted out to sea. The voyage home was uncertain, and omen-haunted and long, the sea offering no comfort, the stars offering only direction. And then the citadel of Mycenae appeared on the horizon, and the great walls that had waited so patiently through 10 years of absence came into view, and the hearth fires of the palace were lit to welcome the king home. We told the ending of Agamemnon's life as the myth remembers it, softly, at a distance, as one speaks of things that belong to the world of story and symbol more than to the world of ordinary hours. We did not linger there. We let it be what it was, and then we let it go. And now here we are, at the last of the fire. The embers are cooling in the dark. The light that has moved through all these evenings together, the lamplight of the palace, the hearth fire of the great hall, the watch fires on the shore of Troy, the single flame burning in the harbor tower at Mycenae, all of that light is settling now into a warm, barely visible glow, the kind that asks nothing of you except that you close your eyes. Agamemnon was a man made of his time and his world, and the long inheritance of his bloodline, and his story has been passing from one sleepless human mind to another for 3,000 years or more, carried through the dark the way a small lamp is carried through a large house, carefully, so that the flame does not go out. Tonight it found you, wherever you are, and now you have it too, quietly somewhere behind your eyes, where all the stories we truly love eventually come to live. Let the fire go low. Let the image of the great citadel on its hill soften at the edges, the painted walls, the lamplight, the smell of salt and bronze and cedar and warm stone. Let the sea be calm tonight. Let the wind be gentle. Let the long story of an ancient king settle into you like warmth, like weight, like the particular comfort of something that has been fully known and now may be fully released. Sleep well, wherever in the world you are resting tonight. The fire has done its work. The dark is very soft.